Settle in and let your eyes grow heavy, because tonight we are going to travel a very long way together, back across 2,000 years to a city built on 7 hills beside a slow and amber river, a city that believed, with every stone it laid and every road it stretched toward the horizon, that it stood at the very center of the world. And perhaps for the people who lived within it, it did. If you find comfort in these slow night journeys through history, there's a way to find them again, night after night, a quiet corner of this channel where the stories are always waiting for you. And all you need to do is subscribe so that they find their way to you in the dark. And if you feel like it, before you drift off tonight, leave a small note in the comments telling us where in the world you are listening from, because there are people lying in the dark just like you, in cities and villages and quiet rooms on every continent, and it is a gentle and rather lovely thing to know that we are all here together, listening. But now, come with me to Rome. It is early morning in the city, perhaps in the years just after the death of the first emperor, Augustus, when the world was still learning what it meant to be governed by a single man and his chosen heirs. The sun has not yet fully cleared the Esquiline Hill, and the light comes in low and golden, sliding along the tops of the insulae, those tall, crowded apartment buildings of brick and timber that house most of the city's 1 million souls, casting long shadows across the cobblestones below. The streets of Rome are already alive. They are always already alive. The city does not sleep so much as shift and change its rhythms, trading the noise of the day for different noises at night, the rumble of delivery carts and the calls of water carriers replacing the shouts of merchants and the clatter of the law courts. You can hear the water first if you listen carefully. Rome is a city in love with water. It arrives constantly, endlessly, through a web of aqueducts that stretch out into the countryside like great stone arms, reaching toward the hills and springs beyond the city's edge. By this period, there are several of these aqueducts already humming with their slow and gravity-fed cargo, and the water they bring pours into fountains at street corners, into the long stone troughs where horses and mules drink, into the great public baths that are already beginning to welcome their first visitors of the morning. The sound of water is everywhere in Rome. A trickle here, a rush there, a deep resonant splash somewhere in the distance where a fountain overflows into a channel in the road. It is the city's heartbeat, running beneath everything else. And if you close your eyes and imagine yourself standing at a crossroads near the Forum, it is perhaps the first thing you notice after the smell of bread, because the bread is already baking. The small bakeries, and there are hundreds of them scattered through every neighborhood, have had their fires lit since before dawn, and the smell drifts through the narrow streets with a warmth that is almost maternal, yeasty and rich, softened by the faint sweetness of something honeyed in one of the better establishments near the Palatine Hill. Bakers in Rome are known to be argumentative and proud, and the story goes that the rivalries between them over the quality of their loaves could be as passionate as any dispute in the Senate. But this early in the morning they are simply working, their arms white to the elbow, their faces flushed from the heat of their ovens, feeding a city that will consume an almost incomprehensible quantity of bread before the day is out. The Forum Romanum, the great open civic heart of the city, lies in the valley between the Capitoline and the Palatine Hills. Walk toward it now in your imagination, down a street that grows gradually wider and more deliberately paved, past the stalls of a flower seller whose blooms are just arriving wrapped in damp cloth, past a barber who has already set up his outdoor chair and is attending to an early customer with the focused efficiency of a man who has cut 10,000 faces and lost count long ago. As you descend toward the Forum, the buildings become larger, the marble more abundant, the sense of intention in the architecture more pronounced. This is where Rome makes its arguments about itself, where it announces in stone and column and gilded inscription what it believes it is and what it wishes the world to understand about its power. The temples are remarkable in this light. The Temple of Saturn, the Temple of Castor and Pollux, the great basilica where lawyers pace and argue, and the smell of parchment mingles with the smell of stone, all of them catching the morning sun at their upper surfaces while their lower colonnades remain in cool blue shadow. Pigeons move along the cornices with an air of complete indifference to all of this grandeur. Cats, of which Rome has an enormous and self-possessed population, pick their way among the honorific statues with similar unconcern. The forum is not yet at its noisy, crowded midday pitch, but it is waking, filling from the edges with men in togas whose hems are already gray with the city's particular dust, with slaves carrying messages and parcels, with a small group of students following a teacher whose gestures suggest he is already deep into some point of rhetoric or philosophy, and has been for some time. Near the river, which the Romans call the Tiber, and which runs through the western edge of the city in wide brown curves, the air changes character. The water here is less the elegant fountain water of the aqueducts, and more a working river's honest smell, mud and fish, and the particular mineral tang of a river that has been used hard by a great city for a great many centuries. The Tiber is the city's artery of commerce. Boats of every size work their way upstream from the port of Ostia at the river's mouth, some of them carrying grain from Egypt and North Africa in great ceramic jars, others loaded with marble from the quarries of Luna, with wine from the volcanic hills of Campania, with olive oil from Spain and Greece and the eastern provinces. The unloading of these boats produces a constant performance of shouting and straining, of ropes under tension and the deep creak of wood, and the men who do this work are broad and dark-complexioned and move with the unhurried competence of people who have done something hard so often that it no longer seems hard. Up on the Palatine Hill, the situation is considerably more composed. This is where the emperor lives, or where the man who holds that particular carefully unnamed power makes his residence, surrounded by the accumulated architecture of Augustan ambition, rooms and gardens and audience halls that manage to be simultaneously enormous and intimate, public and private. The Palatine looks out over the Forum on one side and over the Circus Maximus on the other, and from its terraces on a clear morning you can see the hills beyond the city, soft and blue-green in the distance. There is something watchful about the Palatine, even when it is quiet, as though the hill itself understands that whatever happens within its walls will eventually become the kind of history that people tell one another for a very long time. The city in these early years of the first century, after the birth of Christ, is a place of extraordinary contrasts, held in a kind of perpetual, precarious balance. The tremendous wealth of the senatorial families, whose houses are temples of marble and mosaic and silver, exists a short walk from the cramped upper floors of the insulae, where a family of 5 might share a single room and carry their water up 5 flights of stairs. The formal order of the Roman state, its laws, its magistracies, its intricate and ancient ceremonial, coexists with the raw energy of a city that has grown faster than any plan could contain, spreading and filling and overflowing in every direction. It is a city that is both very old and very young at the same time, proud of its centuries and yet restless with possibility. And somewhere in this city, or in the wider world that this city commands, in the provinces and the frontier camps and the courts of client kings, a family of exceptional lineage and exceptional danger is living its complicated life. The family of Germanicus and Agrippina, soldiers and senators and heirs of emperors, moving through a world that admires them and fears them in almost equal measure. Their story is the one we are here to tell, but that is for tomorrow night, and for now let the sound of the Tiber carry you towards sleep, that wide, brown, unhurried river, receiving all the water that falls on Rome and drawing it slowly, patiently, toward the sea. Somewhere in the eastern reaches of the empire, a trumpet is sounding, not the sharp, urgent cry of battle, but the long, ceremonial note that marks the changing of a watch, drifting out across a parade ground still damp with morning, curling up into a sky the color of pale pewter, before the sun has quite decided to show itself. It is the sound of a world organized, a world disciplined, a world that runs on ritual and repetition, on the turning of seasons and the rotation of legions, on the measured footfall of soldiers who have marched so far from home that home has become a word they carry inside themselves rather than a place they can point to on a map. It is into exactly this world of trumpets and tent canvas and the smell of leather and wood smoke, that the story of Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus properly begins, though the very beginning, the moment of his birth, finds us not in a camp at all, but in a city, amid the particular hush of a household waiting. The year was what later generations would number as the 12th year of what we call the Common Era, and the place was Antium, a coastal town south of Rome where the sea came in long, low swells against limestone cliffs, and where the salt wind moved through the cypress trees with a soft, persistent patience. Antium was a place of some elegance, a retreat from the city's noise, and it is said that the family of Germanicus kept a residence there, as many aristocratic Roman families did, somewhere to breathe, somewhere to rest between the obligations of public life. It is here, according to the ancient sources, that Gaius was born, though some accounts place his birth elsewhere, and the truth of the exact location has softened a little in the long passage of centuries, the way a chalk line softens after rain. What is not in doubt is the family into which he arrived, and that family was by any measure extraordinary. His father was Germanicus Julius Caesar, a man so widely admired in his own lifetime that the admiration itself became a kind of historical fact, outlasting the man and becoming part of the atmosphere surrounding everything connected to his name. Germanicus was the nephew of the Emperor Tiberius, and the adopted son of Tiberius as well, which placed him squarely in the tangled, intricate web of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, a family that had accumulated so much power, so much divine association, and so many complicated loyalties that simply being born into it was itself a kind of destiny, pressing down on a child before the child could speak or walk, or understand the weight of what they carried. Germanicus was tall, it is said, and graceful, and possessed of a quality that the Romans admired enormously, which was the ability to be both a capable soldier and a cultivated, humane man of letters, to be equally at home, reading Greek poetry and commanding a legion, which was the Roman ideal of the complete person, though few enough actually managed it. He was beloved by his troops with something approaching devotion, and by the Roman public with something approaching worship. And this love was genuine in a way that political love rarely is, warm and personal and tinged with a kind of pride, as though in Germanicus the Roman people recognized something they had hoped for in themselves. His mother was Agrippina the Elder, and she was, by all accounts, a woman of formidable intelligence, fierce loyalty, and a will that bent for very little. She was the granddaughter of the Emperor Augustus himself, which gave her a bloodline of almost mythological significance in the Roman imagination. And she wore this heritage not as an ornament, but as a statement of identity, something she carried in her bearing, in the directness of her speech, in the absolute certainty with which she moved through a world that was not, in its formal arrangements, designed to accommodate women of her particular strength. She traveled with her husband on campaign, which was itself remarkable. Not every general's wife went to the frontier, to the cold and the mud, and the unpredictability of life among the legions, but Agrippina did, and she did it not reluctantly but with apparent conviction, as though she understood that her place was where the work was being done, where history was being made in real time, in the field rather than in the drawing rooms of Rome. The soldiers respected her for this. It is said that she walked among the wounded without flinching, organized supply lines, kept order among the camp followers during moments of crisis, and that her presence alone could steady a panicking crowd in a way that spoke not of performance, but of genuine courage, the quiet, deep kind that comes from having decided once and completely what one is willing to face. Into this family then came young Gaius, the fourth surviving child, born after his brothers Nero and Drusus and his sister Agrippina, the younger Agrippina, who would herself one day become one of the most powerful women in the history of Rome, though on the morning of Gaius's birth, she was simply a small girl in a household full of noise and movement and the particular organized chaos of a large, important family that is always in the middle of something. There were more children after Gaius as well, another sister, Drusilla, and another, Livilla, and later a brother, and so the household of Germanicus and Agrippina was a large and lively one, populated with the sounds of children, learning their letters and practicing their Greek declensions, and arguing over small things the way children always do, in every century and every culture, with great seriousness and complete absorption. The early years of Gaius's life were years of movement. His father's campaigns took the family to the edges of the known world, or what Romans considered the edges, which in those years meant the great rivers of the north, the Rhine, the Danube, and the forests beyond them that seemed to stretch without end into a darkness that Roman map-makers rendered with a certain artistic uncertainty, filling in the blank spaces with vague topographical gestures, and the names of tribes that sounded to Roman ears like the sound of the wind itself. It is in this world of military camps and river crossings, and the smell of pine smoke and river clay, that we will find young Gaius again very soon, following his father's eagle standards through a landscape utterly unlike the marble and plaster and sun-warmed terracotta of Rome, learning, before he could have articulated what he was learning, what it meant to live at the edge of empire, to stand at the boundary between the organized world and everything that lay beyond it. But for now, he is small still. He is a boy in the household of a great man and a formidable woman, learning the rhythms of aristocratic Roman life, the morning salutations, the lessons, the prayers at the household shrine where a small lamp burned with a steady, patient flame before the images of the family's guardian spirits, the Lars and Penates, who were believed to watch over the house and all who slept within it. That lamp flickering in the early mornings before the household properly woke, before the servants began moving through the rooms and the sounds of the day began accumulating. That small flame in the quiet is perhaps the most intimate image we can form of his earliest life. A child in a complex and powerful world, watched over by the devotion of his parents and the ritual fires of belief, not yet understanding what the eagles on his father's standards meant, not yet aware that those eagles would one day cast their shadow over him in ways that would shape everything he became. The world he was born into was large and intricate and full of expectation, and the name he carried was heavy with history before he was old enough to write it. But tonight, in these first quiet moments of his story, he is simply a child, and the lamp is burning, and the sea wind moves through the cypress trees outside the window with its soft, persistent patience. And tomorrow, and for many tomorrows, there are long roads ahead, and military camps, and the cold, clear light of northern rivers, and the sound of soldiers calling to one another across the morning. We will walk those roads together gently in the next passage of this story, following the small boy out of the household and into the life of the camps, where the legions would give him the name by which history has always known him. For now, the lamp holds its light, and the night is very still. Lamplight flickers at the edge of a military camp, somewhere in the deep north of the world, where the Rhine moves slowly through its reeds, and the forests beyond the river are so dense and so dark that they seem to breathe in the night air like something alive. It is the early years of the 1st century, and the Roman legions are settled along that great watery border, as they have been for decades, their wooden forts and earthen ramparts rising from the muddy riverbank, like something halfway between a city and a dream, permanent enough to feel like home, temporary enough to remind every soldier that the empire's edge is a restless, uncertain thing. Into this world, young Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus was brought as a very small child, and it is here, among the cook fires and the leather tents and the vast organized noise of a Roman legion going about its daily life, that the story of who he would become really begins to take its first quiet shape. His father, Germanicus, commanded these armies, and the legions adored him for it in the way that soldiers adore a general who seems to actually care whether they live or die. He was present among them, it is said, not merely as a distant figure on horseback, but as someone who appeared in their encampments, who knew something of their particular hardships, who spoke to them and was spoken to in return. Agrippina, his wife, was cut from similarly exceptional cloth, formidable, proud, a granddaughter of Augustus himself, and quite unafraid of the difficulties of life at the frontier. She had followed Germanicus north, and lived among the legions with a composure that the soldiers found remarkable, and it is said they respected her for it in a way that was almost separate from their respect for her husband, something she had earned in her own right, on her own terms. So this is the household that young Gaius grew up inside, not a quiet senatorial home in Rome with garden courtyards and the soft sound of a fountain, but a working military environment, smelling of wood smoke and iron, and the particular earthy dampness of riverbank soil, full of the sounds of drills and hammer blows, and the low, constant murmur of thousands of men living close together. The child moved through all of this as children do, absorbing everything, noticing everything, learning the textures of a world that most Roman children of his class would never see at all. And the soldiers noticed him. This is the part of the story that carries a certain warmth to it. a gentleness that is easy to feel across all the centuries between that riverbank and this moment. The legionaries, hard-weathered men, many of them far from whatever they called home, found themselves charmed by the small son of their beloved general, and they showed it in the most practical way they knew. Someone, at some point, thought it would be amusing and affectionate to dress the child in miniature soldier's equipment. A tiny tunic, a tiny cloak, and most importantly the little boots, the Caligulae, those heavy hobnailed sandals that every Roman foot soldier wore, the ones that left their particular mark in every road and every patch of mud across the empire. Gaius wore a miniature version of these, and the soldiers loved it, and they called him with the uncomplicated warmth of people who work very hard and find great pleasure in small bright things. Caligula. Little boot, little sandal. The name was affectionate in origin. Carry that with you as you rest tonight. It was a nickname given by men who were fond of him, an expression of adoption almost, as if the legions had quietly decided that this child belonged to them as much as to his parents. He was their mascot, their small familiar presence, something soft in a hard place. It is said that in later life, Caligula would come to dislike the name, perhaps because it reminded him of a smallness, a diminishment, a time when he was a child among enormous men and could not yet be anything else. But in those early years along the Rhine, it was simply the name the soldiers gave him, and he wore it the way the boots fit, completely, naturally, as if it had always been his. The days in those camps had a rhythm to them, steady and reliable in the way that military life is always steady and reliable, because an army cannot function without rhythm. The watches turned through the night in regular intervals, marked by the movement of sentries along the ramparts and the distant calls that passed from post to post across the darkness. In the mornings there were drills and the sound of weapons practice, the particular percussion of wooden training swords, striking wooden shields in long, patient repetition. By midday, the smell of the camp kitchens would drift through everything, bread baking, something stewing, the sharp green scent of fresh herbs that someone had thought to bring or forage, because even soldiers want to taste something other than necessity. In the evenings, the fires would be lit, and the camps would settle into that particular quality of evening stillness that belongs to large groups of people who have worked hard all day and are content to be quiet. Young Gaius would have learned in these years something that cannot be taught in any school or by any tutor, the feeling of what it is like when an enormous number of people are organized together toward a common purpose. He would have felt it in his body before he understood it with his mind, the way a legion moves, the way it arranges itself in space, the way authority flows through it from the top to the outermost edges, the way obedience and loyalty and fear and affection all knit together into something that functions. He was learning the grammar of power, while he was still too small to reach the top of a tent post, and it is worth considering, gently and without urgency, what a strange education that was for a child. His mother Agrippina was his other great teacher in those years, though her lessons were of a different kind. She was, by all accounts, a woman of exceptional willpower and political intelligence, and she did not soften herself for the frontier. There are stories, softly reported, shaded with the uncertainty of time, that she sometimes appeared to the soldiers almost in a military capacity herself, that she was present at places and in moments where most Roman women would not have gone. Whether these stories are exactly as they have come down to us, one cannot say with certainty, but they speak to something true about her character. She was not a person who made herself smaller than her circumstances required. What the child absorbed from watching her, daily, in a world that tested people, is something only the river knows for certain. The Rhine itself was a constant presence in all of this, wide and deliberate, moving through its landscape with the unhurried authority of something that has been moving exactly this way for longer than any human story. The soldiers set their watches along its banks, and beyond it the Germanic forests lay dense and secretive, and sometimes in the evenings the mist would come off the water and soften the edges of the whole world, until the camp and the river and the dark tree line beyond all merged into something half-imagined. A child, standing at the edge of such an evening, would have understood, somewhere beneath language, that the world was very large, and that the part of it Rome controlled was only a portion, held in place by the effort of all these men and all these fires burning through all these cold northern nights. Caligula, Gaius, Little Boot, the general's son, grew in that space, in that particular quality of light and cold and organized human effort, and something of it must have entered him and stayed. The camps of Germania were his first home in any sense that he could actually remember, and home makes us in ways we cannot always trace or name, shapes us in patterns we carry long after we have left the place itself. He would leave, of course. The Rhine years could not last forever, and other chapters of his early life were already waiting in the distance, carrying their own shadows and their own particular lessons about how the world arranges itself around power. But that comes later, and for now there is only the river, and the fires, and the small child in the miniature boots, moving through the lamplight of a military evening, with the soldier's easy affection falling around him like something warm. Let the sound of the Rhine carry you gently towards sleep tonight, and when you wake, there will be more of the story waiting, drifting a little further south, a little further into the marble and the noise of Rome itself. The smell of bread reaches you first. It comes before the light, before the voices, before the city has properly decided to be awake. A warm, yeasty breath rising from the street-level openings of the bakeries, where the fires have been burning since long before midnight, where the bakers move in their own slow, flour-dusted world, shaping loaves by touch and habit and the particular weight of dough they have learned to read the way a sailor reads water. The ovens in Rome never truly cool. They pass their heat from one day into the next, like a secret whispered between friends. And by the time the first gray loosening appears above the rooftops, and the terracotta tiles begin to separate themselves from the general darkness of the sky, the bread is already done, already cooling on wooden boards, already waiting for the hands that will carry it away into the unfolding morning. This is Rome in the years of Tiberius, and it is enormous, and it smells of 1,000 things at once. It smells of the bread, yes, and of the wood smoke that clings to every street and alley like a second layer of air, rising from the charcoal braziers that cook the food sold at the counters of the Thermopolia, those warm, busy little shops built into the ground floors of the great apartment blocks, where the serving pots sit in circular openings in the stone counter like birds in their nests, and where a person can buy a cup of heated wine or a bowl of lentils or a twist of something fried and salty without ever quite stopping their walk. It smells of the river, of course, because the Tiber is always there beneath everything, moving its slow brown weight through the city's western edge, carrying the silt of hills and farms and far-off places, smelling of mud and iron and distant rains. Drift a little further into the morning, and you will hear it beginning. The sound of a city of perhaps 1 million souls deciding, all more or less at once, to be in motion. The sound is not a roar. It is more like a rising, like the way a field of birds will begin to murmur and shift before they lift. There are the wheels of the delivery carts, which by law must conduct their business in the hours of darkness, and are only now retreating, rumbling over the stone-paved streets with their loads of timber and amphorae and bolts of cloth, the oxen moving with the patient, unbothered dignity of creatures who have never once hurried. There are the voices of the water carriers, beginning their long rounds from the public fountains that receive the aqueduct's endless gift, filling jugs and pots for households whose apartments sit too high above the street to have any direct connection to the water's flow. There are the scribblings of footsteps, the muttering of conversations, the distant bark of a dog somewhere up on the Aventine, where the morning is arriving in its own time. The city is built on 7 hills, and each one has its own feeling, its own particular relationship with the sky. On the Palatine, which rises above the Forum with a kind of calm, inhabited authority, the emperor's palace spreads itself across the height, a complex of buildings and gardens and porticos that has grown room by room and wing by wing over the generations, absorbing the private houses of the powerful the way a slow vine absorbs a stone wall. From certain terraces up there, on a clear morning, a person could look out across the entire sweep of the city and see the smoke of it rising in 100 thin columns, bending together at a certain height, as the wind found them and turned them all the same direction, so that the city seemed to be breathing out, slowly and all at once, the way a sleeping person breathes. Below the Palatine, the Forum Romanum fills with its daily life. This is the heart of things, or it understands itself to be the old rectangular space bounded by temples and basilicas and the rostra from which orators have addressed the crowd for centuries. The stones of its pavement worn smooth by the passing of generations of sandals and bare feet, and the hooves of animals led through on their way to sacrifice. The temples glow in the morning light with the particular golden white luminescence of travertine stone, their columns throwing long shadows across the pavement in the early hours, shadows that shorten and vanish as the sun climbs, and then begin again their slow lengthening toward evening. There are the temples of Saturn and of Vesta and of the divine Julius, and between them the everyday business of the Republic, or what remains of it, continues its transactions. Lawyers consult with clients in the shade of colonnades, scribes sit at portable desks, money changes hands, wander further from the forum, and the city deepens and complicates itself. The insulae, the great multi-storied apartment blocks, rise 4 and 5 and sometimes 6 stories above the streets, their upper floors leaning slightly toward one another across the narrow alleyways between them, so that in the oldest neighborhoods, the sky above is reduced to a long pale ribbon, glimpsed between the washing lines and the projecting wooden balconies. These are the neighborhoods where most of Rome actually lives, not in villas or in palace rooms, but in these dense, busy, layered hives of humanity, where a family might occupy a single room and cook their meals on a brazier by the window, where the noise of a neighbor is as intimate as the noise of one's own breathing, where the street below is an extension of the home because the home itself contains so little. By mid-morning the baths are beginning to fill. The great public thermae are among the finest things Rome has made, not because of their luxury, though there is luxury in them, but because of their democracy, their belonging to everyone. A man might come here for the price of a small coin, or sometimes for nothing at all, and move through the sequence of rooms that the Romans have determined to be the correct and pleasing order of a bath. The changing room with its rows of alcoves, the warm room where the body begins to release its tensions, the hot room where the steam rises from the pools and the skin goes soft and open, and then the cold plunge that closes everything again and sends a person back into the world feeling, for a little while, entirely restored. In the bath complexes, there are rooms for exercise and rooms for conversation, and even rooms where books can be borrowed and read, and the walls are covered in mosaic and painted plaster, and the light filters through the high windows in long dusty shafts that move slowly across the floor as the hours pass. Beyond the baths and the forums, if you follow the roads that lead down toward the river, and then south along its western bank, you come eventually to the great warehouse district, the Emporium, where Rome's appetite for everything the world produces is being constantly, endlessly satisfied. Here the docks are thick with ships from every coast of the sea the Romans call their own, from the grain ports of Egypt and Africa, from the olive oil regions of Spain, from the wine islands of Greece in the east, from the glassmakers of Syria, and the silk routes that bring their goods through Alexandria. The ships sit low in the water with their loads, and the stevedores move between ship and dock in long shuffling lines, balancing amphorae on their shoulders, their bodies adapted by years of labor to the particular angle of this work, so that they seem to lean into the weight rather than fight it, and the weight seems almost to rest there willingly. The afternoon light on the Tiber, when it comes at the right angle in certain seasons, turns the river briefly golden, and the surface of the water catches that light and scatters it into small bright fragments that move and disappear and are remade continuously, the way certain thoughts do when you are half asleep and the mind is releasing its grip on the shapes it usually insists on maintaining. By evening, the city softens again. The cooking fires are lit in 1,000 rooms, and the smoke rises, and the smell of garlic and onion and roasting meat moves through the streets. The public fountains catch the last of the light in the water that always spills from their lips, always moving, never still. The temples on the hilltops glow against the darkening sky, their marble taking on a warmth it does not have in the midday glare, becoming almost amber, almost like skin. And somewhere in the apartment blocks, in the rooms stacked one above another in the darkness, lamps are being lit, small clay lamps fed with olive oil, their flames no larger than a thumbnail, casting their warm and wavering circles in the darkness. In all of this enormous, breathing, smoky, storied city, there is a young man absent. Gaius, who the soldiers called Caligula, is far away from these streets, and these rivers and these temples. He is learning in the years of Tiberius what it means to survive in a world that has taken nearly everything from him, and what he is learning in that long and watchful season will carry him eventually back to the city that even now burns its 1,000 lamps without him. The oil in the lamps grows low. There is a particular quality to silence in a large house when it has recently been full of people. A kind of held breath in the rooms, a heaviness in the curtains, a way the lamps seem to burn a little lower than they did before, as though the fire itself remembers what warmth once gathered around it and feels the absence now. That is the silence that settled over the household of Germanicus and Agrippina in the years after Germanicus was gone, a silence that deepened not all at once, but gradually like water rising in a cistern, slow and inevitable and cold. Gaius was still very young when his father died in the east, in the city of Antioch, in the 17th year of what we now call the 1st century of the Common Era. He was no more than 7 years old, perhaps, old enough to understand that something enormous and irreversible had occurred, young enough that the full shape of it could not yet be seen clearly, the way a child standing at the foot of a mountain cannot perceive the mountain's height, only its shadow falling across the ground. The news would have traveled by ship and by horse, by relay and by messenger, arriving in Rome after weeks of sea and road, and when it came it brought with it not only grief, but something more complicated and more dangerous, the question of who was responsible. It is said that Germanicus had quarreled with Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso, the governor of Syria, a man appointed by the Emperor Tiberius himself. It is said that the quarrel had grown bitter and deep, and that when Germanicus fell ill and died, his wife Agrippina and his friends did not believe for a moment that his death had been a simple matter of fever and misfortune. They believed, or they said they believed, or perhaps they needed to believe because the alternative, that a man so beloved, so capable, so luminous could simply be extinguished by ordinary illness, was more than grief could hold. Piso was brought to trial in Rome, and the trial was a great public spectacle, the whole city watching, the air in the forum thick with murmured accusation and counter-accusation. Before it concluded, Piso was found dead, and whether that death was his own doing or someone else's, the story has never fully resolved. The fire of that unanswered question kept burning long after the ashes of the trial had cooled. Agrippina, who was a woman of extraordinary force and dignity, had carried her husband's ashes home herself, sailing across the Mediterranean and up the Italian coast with the urn in her hands, and the crowds that gathered at every port to honor her and weep with her were a testament to how deeply Germanicus had been loved. But love and grief and public sympathy are not the same thing as safety, and Agrippina, for all her strength, was a woman whose strength made her enemies, and the greatest of those enemies sat upon the throne of Rome. Tiberius was not a simple man, and it would be too easy to paint him as simply cold or simply cruel. He was in many ways an effective ruler, a careful steward of the empire's finances and frontiers, a man who had spent decades in the service of Augustus and understood the machinery of power with a thoroughness that few could match. But he was also deeply suspicious, perhaps genuinely so, haunted by the knowledge that in Rome's new order, a popular rival, even an unintentional one, could become the seed of a conspiracy simply by existing. And Agrippina, fiercely loyal to her husband's memory and openly contemptuous of those she suspected of his death, was not unintentional about anything. She was, in that way, her mother's daughter. Julia, the daughter of Augustus, had been similarly unguarded, similarly unwilling to perform contentment she did not feel, and it had cost Julia everything. The years that followed Germanicus's death were years of slow erosion for his family. Tiberius's great favorite, the Praetorian prefect Lucius Aelius Sejanus, a man of remarkable ambition, who had made himself nearly indispensable to the aging emperor, directed his energies partly toward the destruction of what remained of Germanicus's line, seeing in that family a source of popular loyalty that could only be a threat to his own carefully constructed position. Agrippina was accused of various plots and conspiracies, accusations that drifted through the Senate with the particular quality of rumors that have been carefully arranged to look spontaneous. In the 32nd year of the Common Era, she was sent into exile on the small island of Pandateria, the same island where her own mother Julia had been exiled a generation before, and there, it is said, she eventually died, broken not by dramatic violence, but by the slow, grinding cruelty of isolation and despair. Her sons, Gaius's older brothers, Nero and Drusus, who were named for the great men of the family that had come before, had already been destroyed by then. Nero the eldest was accused of treason, exiled and died on another island, possibly by his own hand, possibly by other means that preferred not to announce themselves. Drusus was imprisoned, held in a dungeon beneath the Palatine, and the story goes that he was kept alive long enough to suffer, and then allowed to die of starvation, a death of such deliberate cruelty that even in a city that had grown accustomed to the darkest possibilities of power, it was spoken of in hushed and horrified tones. And Gaius watched all of this happen. He was a child and then a young man, as his family was dismantled around him one by one. His mother gone, his brothers gone, his father already a memory. He was by now perhaps 15, 16, 17 years old, living in a world that had become very small and very dangerous, with very few people he could trust, and very little room for error. The fire that had once burned so brightly at the center of his family, Germanicus, laughing and generous in the torchlight of the camps, Agrippina fierce and warm, the whole household full of children and dogs and visiting legionaries, and the smell of whatever the camp kitchens were preparing. All of that warmth had been systematically extinguished, and what remained was a young man in the company of people who might at any moment become his accusers. There is something that happens to a person who lives for years in the presence of danger, without the relief of ever fully escaping it. Something shifts in the way they hold themselves, in the way they read a room, in the way they choose their words, not all at once, not in any single dramatic moment, but gradually, the way metal changes under pressure, becoming something harder and stranger than it was before. Gaius had learned in the camps of Germania to be charming and easy with soldiers. Now he was learning something different, how to be invisible, how to seem harmless, how to give away nothing. He went eventually to live with his great-grandmother Livia, the formidable widow of Augustus, and then after her death with his grandmother Antonia, who was herself a woman of great dignity and deep private grief, having outlived so many of the people she had loved. These women understood something of what it meant to survive in proximity to power, and whatever guidance they offered the young Gaius, it was guidance shaped by hard experience rather than comfortable theory. And then, when he was perhaps 19 or 20 years old, came the summons that must have felt like walking to the edge of a very high cliff. Tiberius sent for him and asked him to come to Capri. Tiberius had withdrawn from Rome years before, retreating to that small and extraordinary island off the coast near Neapolis, its white cliffs rising from the sea, its villas clinging to the rock above water that shimmered in shades of green and blue and the deep clear gray of early morning. There, on that island above the sea, the old emperor had built his court, and from there he governed, and it was to that place of watchful seclusion that Caligula was now being called. The lamp flame bends a little in the telling of this, guttering gently, as if the air around it understands that something quiet and significant is approaching. The years of danger are behind us now, not fully resolved, not fully healed, but behind, and ahead lies the strange, suspended world of the island, the sea air, the old man and the young one, living together above the water, in a silence they had both, each in their own way, been learning for years. Rest now, the sea is very calm tonight, and Capri is waiting just a little further on. The sea arrives before anything else, the sound of it, low and constant, folding against limestone cliffs in the darkness below, retreating, returning, the way breath returns, the way sleep returns when you stop fighting it. Capri sits in the waters of the Tyrrhenian Sea, like something the gods set down and then forgot about. A small island of white rock and salt air and terraced gardens that cling to the hillsides as though they too are trying not to be noticed, not to draw attention, not to fall. It is an island that keeps its own counsel. The wind moves through its cypress trees and says nothing intelligible, and the sea below murmurs in a language older than Latin, older than Rome, older than any emperor who ever looked out from its heights and believed himself to be the center of everything. Tiberius came to Capri in what we count as the 26th year of the Common Era, and he never really left. He was an old man by then, at least by the measure of his age, weathered and suspicious, a man who had spent so many decades watching for treachery that he had begun to see it in everything, in a senator's too formal greeting, in a servant's averted eyes, in the silence after a joke that no one quite laughed at. He built himself a villa on the island's highest cliff, the Villa Jovis, the house of Jupiter, and there he governed an empire of 50 million souls by letter, by messenger, by the scratch of a stylus on wax tablets that were carried by boat to the mainland and then carried onward by relay riders along the great roads that stretched to every corner of the known world. The empire somehow continued. The roads were repaired, the legions were paid, the grain moved from Egypt to Rome in the holds of heavy ships, and Tiberius sat on his cliff above the sea and trusted almost no one. Into this world, sometime in the 31st or 32nd year, came young Gaius, Caligula, as history would remember him, brought to Capri to live in the household of the old emperor. He was perhaps 19 or 20 years old, a lean young man with watchful eyes, and a name that carried both the glory of the julio-claudian line and the shadow of tremendous loss. His father, the great Germanicus, was 10 years dead. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, whom we have already visited in the wind-scoured camps of the northern frontier, was by now imprisoned on the island of Panditaria, exiled by the very emperor, who now invited her surviving son to share his table. 2 of Caligula's brothers had already been destroyed, one dead in prison, one forced to take his own life, or so the story goes, both counted as enemies of the state, both removed from the world with the quiet efficiency that Tiberius had perfected over long years of careful, patient politics. And now Gaius sat at dinner with the man who had, directly or indirectly, unmade nearly everyone he had ever loved. What he felt during those years, no one can say with any certainty. The ancient writers who left accounts of Caligula were not fond of him. Most wrote after his death, under the shadow of what came later, and they shaped his story accordingly. But even they record something that reads, in a quieter light, as simple and understandable survival. Gaius, they tell us, never showed grief for his mother or his brothers. He never demanded explanations. He never let his expression slip into something that might be read as accusation or resentment or longing. He was, by all accounts, pleasant at dinner, deferential in conversation, careful never to claim more importance than the moment allowed. He watched, he listened, he adapted. He became whatever the room required him to be. One of the ancient sources, Suetonius, that tireless collector of imperial gossip, puts it in a way that is both harsh and perhaps without intending to be, almost admiring. He wrote that never was there a better slave or a worse master. The cruelty of the observation cuts in both directions at once, and it is worth letting it sit there for a moment, in the way that a thing resting on the edge of meaning sometimes needs to be left undisturbed before it becomes clear. A boy who had grown up in the thunderous affection of the legions, who had been passed from soldier to soldier like a mascot of something beloved and uncomplicated, who had been taught by his father's example that a general should walk openly among his men and eat the same food and share the same cold. That boy had now learned something entirely different. He had learned that survival on this particular cliff above this particular sea required a different kind of courage, the courage of stillness, the courage of the unreadable face. The island itself would have enforced a certain quality of contemplation simply by its nature. Capri in those years was not the place of white-walled luxury it would become in later imaginings, though there was certainly comfort enough in the Imperial villa, with its colonnaded terraces and its views across the blue distance toward the mainland. But it was also enclosed. It was also small. A young man could walk its paths and watch the sea from different heights, and measure the distance to Rome in the slow procession of supply boats that arrived at the little harbor below. He could smell the salt and the wild herbs that grew in the thin soil of the hillsides, rosemary and thyme releasing their oils into the air when the sun warmed them, and he could watch the gulls drift on the updrafts from the cliffs, turning without effort in the moving air, going nowhere in particular, requiring nothing of the wind except that it continue to be present. The old emperor, for his part, seems to have found Gaius useful, or at least not threatening, which on Capri amounted to much the same thing. Tiberius was by now a man surrounded by so many genuine threats and imagined ones, that a quiet young man who laughed at the right moments and raised no difficult questions must have been, in his way, a relief. It is said that Tiberius once remarked, in a phrasing that has the sourness of experience behind it, that he was raising a serpent for the Roman people. Whether he believed this, or whether he said it in one of his darker moods and let it pass like smoke on the sea wind, we cannot know. What we know is that he did not destroy Gaius. He kept him close. He made him a priest, the priestly college of augurs, the readers of omens and signs. And this was the kind of official recognition that marked a young man as worth watching, worth investing in, worth maintaining in reasonable comfort while the world sorted itself out. The sea would have been constant through all of it. On Capri, the sound of the water never entirely disappears. The cliffs amplify it at night, when the other sounds fall away. The calls of the household servants, the movement of guards on the colonnaded walks, the distant voices of men playing dice by lamplight in some lower courtyard. In the quiet, after all of that, the sea would have continued its long, unhurried conversation with the limestone below. The same sound it had made for centuries, before there was any Roman Empire to speak of, and would continue to make long after the names of emperors had softened into legend, and then into something even vaguer than that. A young man lying awake on that island, in whatever room was given to him, would have measured the night by it, would have let it become the rhythm against which his own careful breathing settled. He learned patience there. Whether he learned wisdom, or something darker than wisdom, is a question the island cannot answer. It only continued to exist, salt-white and wind-carved, above its indifferent sea. And so the years on Capri moved past quietly, the way certain chapters of a life always do in the retelling. The years in which nothing dramatic can be pointed to. The years that are really about an interior rearrangement, a slow repositioning of everything a person understands about power and danger, and the distance between what one feels and what one shows. 6 years, perhaps, of small dinners and careful words and the sound of the sea at night. 6 years of watching an old man govern the world by letter from a cliff. 6 years of learning what it costs to be alive. Somewhere on the mainland, always visible on a clear day across the blue channel of water, Rome waited. Its smoke was sometimes visible from the heights of Capri, a faint haze on the northern horizon, the exhalation of a million lives going about their daily business of baking and hammering and arguing and worshipping and simply being alive in the largest city the Western world had ever known. It waited, as it had always waited, for the next thing to happen. And in the villa above the sea, the old man's lamp burned lower and lower through the long nights, until the night that it did not return to brightness with the morning. But that stillness, the island's last gift of quiet, belongs to tomorrow's telling. And for now there is only the sea, moving in the dark below the white cliffs, and the slow, unhurried breath of a world resting between one moment and the next. The lamps were still burning on Capri when the news began its slow travel toward the mainland, carried first by a single fast boat cutting through the gray morning water of the Tyrrhenian Sea, then by riders on the coastal road, then by word of mouth moving through markets and doorways in the crowded morning streets of Rome like a warm wind moving through dry grass. Tiberius was dead. The old man who had ruled for 22 long years with a face like carved stone and a heart that trusted almost no one, had drawn his final breath sometime in the middle of March, in the year that would later be numbered as 37 years after the birth of Christ. He was 77 years old, and he had lived long enough for nearly everyone in Rome to have grown up knowing no other emperor. The stories that gathered around his death were already contradictory before the body had been brought back to the mainland. Some said he had simply faded, as very old men do, his strength retreating from him the way tide retreats from shore, slowly and without drama, until there was nothing left. Others whispered, and they whispered quietly, because habits of caution do not vanish overnight, that the end had come with a little more assistance. It is said that Caligula, or perhaps the Praetorian prefect Macro, or perhaps both together in some unspoken understanding, had hastened what nature was already preparing to complete. Some accounts suggest a pillow pressed briefly over the old man's face, Others speak only of a ring removed from his finger while he still drew breath. The truth of those final hours in the villa at Misenum is one of those things history has chosen to keep soft and indistinct, and perhaps it is better that way, for what followed belonged entirely to the living. What followed was joy. It is difficult now, at this great distance of centuries, to fully feel the quality of that joy, to understand how deep and strange and almost desperate it was. Tiberius had not always been a bad emperor in the practical sense. The roads had been maintained, the borders had held, the grain had largely arrived on time, but he had been cold in a way that the Roman people found genuinely difficult to bear. A man who had retreated to his island and governed an empire through letters and suspicion, who had allowed the years of terror under the prefect Sejanus to hollow out the Senate and the noble families, who had watched from his cliffs while accusations multiplied and trials consumed the innocent alongside the guilty. Rome had been living for years in a low, persistent dread, the way one lives through a long gray winter, almost forgetting that the air had once felt different. And now, suddenly, here was the son of Germanicus, Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, whom the soldiers had always called Caligula, Little Boots, a name that had followed him since his childhood days in the camps of Germania, was 24 years old when Macro placed the Praetorian Guard formally at his side and the transfer of power began. He was young, which was itself a kind of medicine. He was the son of a man the Roman people had genuinely loved, which counted for an enormous amount in a culture where bloodlines carried their own kind of light. And he had survived. He had lived through the dangerous years under Tiberius with his life intact, which the crowd perhaps took as evidence of some particular resilience, some essential goodness that the old emperor's suspicion had not managed to extinguish. The historian Suetonius would later write that as Caligula traveled from Misenum toward Rome, people poured out to meet him on the road, that the villages and the farmlands and the hills themselves seemed to brighten with the crowds that gathered to see him pass. He was called their star, their chick, their nursling, words of tenderness that Romans reserved for those who seemed to embody something they had been waiting for, without quite knowing how to name it. It is said the sacrifices made in those first days of celebration numbered in the hundreds of thousands of animals at temples throughout the empire, that the altars were warm from dawn to dusk with gratitude and offering. Whether these numbers are precisely accurate matters less than what they suggest about the feeling in the air. Something released, like breath held too long, finally let go. Caligula himself entered Rome with Tiberius's body in the funeral procession, and whatever he felt in those hours, grief, relief, a vertigo of sudden power, he wore the face of a mourning grandson, which was the appropriate face, and the crowd gave him credit for it. The funeral was conducted with dignity. Tiberius was granted his divine honors in the end, though some accounts suggest the Senate would have preferred otherwise. Caligula chose generosity, and in those early days, generosity seemed to be his natural element. He paid out the legacies that Tiberius had promised in his will, and had been revised in a later codicil that the Senate conveniently declined to ratify. He gave the Praetorian Guard their promised bonuses. He gave the people of Rome and of Italy money from his own inheritance. He recalled those who had been exiled under Tiberius's reign, burned the documents that had supported the accusations against them, and declared openly that he had no interest in using informers or holding trials for treason. He stood before the Senate and offered them a partnership, or at least said the words that sounded like an offer of partnership, promising to rule not as a tyrant above them, but as a citizen among them. The Senate wept, quite literally wept, if the sources can be trusted, which with the Senate's more theatrical responses one can never be entirely certain. But the tears, real or performed, tell us something about the atmosphere of those first weeks. There was a sense that the world had turned, that a long darkness had broken, that something genuinely new was beginning. There were small gestures that the Roman people noticed and loved. Caligula attended the public games and watched them with visible pleasure, not with the cold detachment Tiberius had always shown. He restored the practice of publishing the accounts of the imperial treasury, giving the public access to information that had been quietly withheld. He was seen in the streets. He was seen at the theater. He laughed, apparently, and laughed in ways that invited others to laugh with him, rather than performing amusement, while watching to see who laughed too much, or at the wrong moment. After so many years of a ruler who seemed to find the company of other human beings essentially distasteful, the sight of a young emperor who appeared to genuinely enjoy being alive among his people was almost disorienting in its pleasantness. His sisters, Drusilla, Livilla, and Agrippina the Younger, the surviving children of Germanicus's household, were given unprecedented public honors, their names included in oaths and prayers alongside the emperor's own. This too felt like healing, like a family reassembled, like the warmth of Germanicus's memory made present again in the faces of his children, standing together in the Roman sun. The fleet of boats that had once carried Caligula's mother and brothers in chains across the same waters he now traveled freely must have been somewhere in his memory during those days of celebration. The ghosts of his father, his mother, his brothers Nero and Drusus, all those absorbed by the machine of Tiberian suspicion. He carried them with him into his new life, and perhaps the Roman people understood that, and felt the weight of that inheritance, and loved him a little more for having survived it. For now, though, the weight was invisible beneath the brightness of everything. Rome was garlanded and warm. The offerings on the altars sent thin smoke rising into the mild spring sky. The streets were full of people who had chosen, at least for this moment, to believe that things would be different now, that the long gray years were truly finished, that something generous and golden had finally arrived to stay. Somewhere in the palace, in rooms that were now his, a lamp would have burned through that first night of his reign, steady and quiet, throwing its warm circle against marble walls that had known so many different emperors, so many different moods of power. He was 24 years old, and the whole empire was his, and the people loved him, and the night outside was mild with early spring, and all of it seemed for now like something that could last. There would be time enough in the weeks and months ahead to begin the long and careful work of understanding what it truly meant to hold such a thing in one's hands. That story waits gently for another evening, unhurried and close. There is a particular quality to Roman light in early spring, when the hills are still faintly green, and the Tiber runs full and cold, and the whole city seems to breathe a little more easily than it did in winter. It is the light of reopening, of doors swung wide after long darkness. And in the weeks that followed the young emperor's arrival in Rome from Misenum, that light seemed to fall on everything with unusual generosity, gilding the marble of the temples and warming the worn stones of the forum, and catching in the bronze of statues so that the whole city appeared to glow from within, as though the city itself had been waiting for this particular season and this particular young man to arrive together. He was not yet 25 years old. His name, the full formal name that now rang from the rostra and appeared on documents and coins in the lips of heralds, was Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, though the people of Rome called him simply Gaius, or sometimes whispered the old camp nickname with a kind of tender pride, as though the word Caligula connected this magnificent young ruler to the beloved father whose memory still lived warmly in so many hearts. He had come to Rome on a tide of feeling that was almost impossible to separate from grief and relief and something older and more desperate than either. The sheer exhausted longing of a people who had spent the last years of Tiberius's reign learning to say nothing, to trust no one, to read every silence as a potential accusation. And now here was a young man on the throne, and he was Germanicus's son, and the lamps in the windows burned a little longer that spring, as though no one quite wanted the evenings to end. The gestures came quickly, and they were the right gestures, chosen with what seemed like genuine feeling, rather than the cold calculation of a man simply performing generosity. Among the first of his acts was the honoring of his mother Agrippina and his brother Nero Julius Caesar, recalling their memories from the official silence into which Tiberius had pressed them. He sailed personally, it is said, to the islands where their ashes had been kept, and he carried those ashes back to Rome himself, placing them in the mausoleum of Augustus. And the people who lined the harbors and the roads watched this with the kind of feeling that does not need words, that lives instead in the way a crowd goes still and quiet in the presence of something it recognizes as real. He was not performing grief. He was completing something long unfinished, giving back to his family the dignity that the years on Capri and the years of fear had stripped away. And in doing so, he was giving something back to the Roman people as well. Permission perhaps to remember openly, to speak of Germanicus again without lowering their voices. He released those who had been imprisoned or exiled under the old reign on charges of treason, those tangled and terrifying accusations that had consumed so many lives in the twilight of Tiberius's rule. And he made a public occasion of destroying the documents in which those accusations had been recorded, or so the story goes, carrying them to the forum and burning them there, and declaring that he had not read them, that he would not use them, that the past was the past, and the new reign would not feed on the fears of the old one. Whether all of those documents were truly destroyed, or whether some were quietly preserved in some shadowed archive, is a question that later centuries would find reason to ask. But in those early weeks, the gesture was received as truth, and truth was what Rome needed most. The smoke rose and dispersed over the rooftops, and people watched it go and breathed again. He gave money to the Praetorian Guard, because that was the custom, the necessary acknowledgement of the men whose spears and shields made the throne a real and physical thing. But he also gave donatives to the people of Rome more broadly, not only the formal distributions of grain that the system expected, but additional gifts, silver pressed into hands, and spectacles staged in the circus and amphitheater with a lavishness that left crowds dazzled and happy in the way that only Rome could be made happy by the combination of action and largesse and the sense that the man at the center of it all genuinely wished them well. He attended the games himself, visibly, enthusiastically, without the careful aloofness that Tiberius had so often worn like a second toga. He sat among the people in spirit, even when he sat above them in position, and they felt it, and they loved him for it. He was careful also about the Senate, at least in those early months. He made reassuring speeches, full of language about the restoration of proper governance, about his willingness to share power and to rule in the manner of Augustus, rather than the manner the last years of Tiberius had become. He gave back to the popular assemblies certain electoral functions that had drifted away from them, a gesture with more symbolic weight than practical consequence, but symbols were the grammar of Roman public life, and this one was read clearly. He addressed the senators as colleagues rather than subjects, or so the accounts suggest, speaking of them as partners in the great work of governing an empire that stretched from the cold northern rivers to the burning southern sands, from the Atlantic shores to the edge of the eastern world, where the Parthian kings watched from behind their silk and gold. There was a particular incident that the sources remember, and remember fondly, which speaks to the mood of those months as clearly as any formal policy. A young man of the senatorial class, meeting the emperor, fainted from sheer overwhelmed emotion, from excitement or nerves, or the sheer improbability of finding himself face to face with the most powerful person in the world. And Caligula, rather than ignoring this or receiving it with cold dignity, is said to have responded with warmth, even with laughter, the kind of laughter that includes rather than excludes, that recognizes the vulnerability of the moment rather than exploiting it. It is a small story, and perhaps embellished in the retelling, but small stories are often where the real texture of a personality lives, and this one suggests someone who, in those months at least, wore his enormous power without having been entirely consumed by it. He recalled men from exile, he appointed good governors to the provinces, he took care of his grandmother Antonia, and when she died in those early months, he buried her with full honors. He brought order to the financial accounts of the imperial household with something that looked like genuine attention to the public good. Everything that the reign of Tiberius had made strange and frightened and withered, the new young emperor seemed to be quietly setting up right again, the way a careful gardener moves through a neglected garden in spring, lifting what has been bent down by winter and turning it back toward the light. And through all of it, the people of Rome watched and celebrated and pressed forward at every public appearance to catch a glimpse of him, this young man who was Germanicus's son, who had lived through danger and come through it still smiling, who distributed grain and silver and the even more valuable currency of feeling seen and appreciated and governed by someone who did not hate them for existing. Letters went to the provinces describing the new reign, and travelers carried the news along the roads that stretched in every direction from the golden milestone at the center of the city. and in the legions on the Rhine and the Danube, and in the trading cities of the East, and in the heat of Egypt, the news arrived and was received with relief and celebration, because everyone who lived within the vast breathing body of the empire understood that the mood at the center had consequences for everything at the edges. In the mood at the center, in the spring and early summer of the year Gaius became emperor, was the best it had been in a very long time. It is worth resting in that moment for a while before moving forward. It is worth letting it settle, the way good news settles slowly and warmly, the way lamplight settles across a room when someone finally comes home. There would be time enough for other seasons, but this one, this particular spring of open doors and returned exiles and games and grain, and a young man who seemed to want nothing so much as to be worthy of the love the city was pouring over him. This one deserves to be held gently and felt completely and allowed to be what it was, a beginning, a real and luminous beginning. And as that spring deepened into summer, and the city went on living its vast, complicated life, in its kitchens and its temples and its lamplight gardens, the lamplight burning steady and kind in the windows of 1,000,000 households, there was in Rome something that had not been there for years and would prove more fragile than anyone yet knew how to imagine, the quiet spreading warmth of hope. Smoke rises before dawn in the city of Rome, thin and pale against a sky that has not yet decided whether it belongs to night or morning, curling upward from 1,000 hearth fires as the great restless organism of the city stirs itself, slowly, the way a sleeping animal shifts its weight before opening its eyes. It begins in the kitchens, in the grand houses on the Palatine and the Aventine, in the modest insulae where families of 4 or 5 share 2 small rooms above a street that never truly falls silent, in the tabernae whose shuttered fronts will soon be folded back to reveal their counters of warm terracotta and their great clay pots sunk into stone. The fires come alive first. The kitchen slaves, and there are always kitchen slaves in any household that can afford them, have been awake for an hour already, feeding the small iron braziers and the larger clay ovens with bundles of olive wood and dried vine cuttings, wood that gives a particular fragrance as it catches, something sweet and faintly resinous, a smell so woven into the fabric of Roman morning that to encounter it is to feel, somewhere below conscious thought, that the world is in order, that the day will proceed as days should. Grain is measured out for porridge, the slow morning kind, stirred in a pot with a long wooden spoon by someone still drowsy, moving in the unhurried rhythm of a task done 10,000 times before. Honey waits in a small amphora, dried figs sit in a clay bowl, bread that was baked the evening before at the street corner bakery is unwrapped from its linen cloth, and the kitchen fills with the smell of grain and warmth and the particular intimacy of early morning food. The gardens wake more slowly than the kitchens. In the wealthier homes, the garden is not merely decorative, but is understood to be a kind of room, the most important room, open to the sky, governed by the seasons, tended by hands that know each plant by temperament as much as by name. At this hour, just as the first true light begins to pool in the eastern corner of the peristyle, the garden holds a particular stillness that feels earned, as though it has waited through the dark hours for this exact quality of softness. Roses are grown here, the deep red ones that Romans love above almost all others, heavy-headed and fragrant in summer, gone by autumn and mourned until spring. Herbs crowd the lower beds. Rosemary, which the Romans call rosmarinus, dew of the sea, for the way it seems to hold moisture even on dry hillsides. Mint in its many varieties, bay laurel clipped into modest shapes, and the small yellow flowers of rue, which is planted near doorways because it is said to keep certain misfortunes at a distance, fed by one of the great aqueducts that bring mountain water down into the city in a perpetual unhurried generosity, and the sound of that water falling into its basin is perhaps the most Roman sound of all, the sound of engineering made musical, of a civilization that decided water should move through its cities like a permanent gift. Children appear in the gardens after breakfast. The smallest ones come out clutching wooden toys of cloth animals, followed at a cautious distance by the slave or freedwoman appointed to watch over them, and they move through the garden with the absolute confidence of small people who have not yet learned to be uncertain, touching the rosemary and releasing its sharp green fragrance into the morning air, chasing the butterflies that visit the roses, crouching to examine with great seriousness whatever interesting thing lies at the base of the garden wall. Slightly older children are already on their way through the city streets toward the schoolmaster, who teaches in whatever covered space he can arrange. Sometimes a covered walkway at the edge of a forum, sometimes a room rented above a shop, and who will spend the morning drilling letters and numbers and the rhythms of Latin verse into his small charges with the patient persistence of someone who knows that most of what he teaches will need to be repeated many times before it takes hold. The temples open as the sun clears the hills. Rome is a city of extraordinary religious density, a place where the sacred and the ordinary are threaded together so thoroughly that it is impossible to walk any street for very long without encountering a shrine, a small altar, an image of a god set into a wall niche with a little oil lamp burning before it. The great temples, the temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline, the temple of Saturn at the far end of the Forum, the round and lovely temple of Vesta, where the sacred fire is kept burning by the Vestal Virgins, with a continuity measured not in years but in centuries. These are the formal, ceremonial face of Roman religion, approached on particular days with particular rites conducted by priests in particular robes. But the everyday religion of the city is smaller and more intimate than that. It lives in the Lararium, the household shrine found in nearly every Roman home, where small bronze or terracotta figures of the Lares, the guardian spirits of the household, stand in a miniature temple-shaped cabinet, and where the family makes small daily offerings of incense, a little wine poured out, a piece of food, a flower from the garden. The gesture is brief, habitual, woven into the rhythm of the morning the way a breath is woven into living, unremarkable precisely because it is so constant. Women in the city move through a world of layered obligations and unexpected freedoms. The image of the Roman woman confined entirely to domestic space is, if one looks closely at the evidence, something of an oversimplification, because Roman women of the middle and upper classes might be found at the baths, at the market, at the temple, visiting friends, managing the financial affairs of households whose complexity would challenge a professional administrator. The Roman wife of a prosperous family might oversee a staff of dozens, keep accounts, correspond on behalf of her husband's business interests, and educate herself in philosophy and literature with a seriousness that some of the men around her found admirable and others found, one suspects, somewhat disconcerting. The working women of the lower city, the sellers of bread and cloth and oil, the dyers and the weavers, the midwives and the women who keep the tabernae running while their husbands mind some other business. These women move through the streets with the ease of long practice, calling greetings, conducting small negotiations, living lives of physical density and social richness that the quieter marble rooms of the Palatine would never know. The baths receive the afternoon. From mid-afternoon onward, as the serious business of the day softens into something more social, the great public bath complexes, the thermae, fill with the sound of human conversation, multiplied into a warm, continuous hum. The Romans have made bathing into something so elaborate and pleasant that it has ceased to be merely hygienic and become instead one of the primary social institutions of city life. One moves through a sequence of rooms graduated by temperature. The cool frigidarium, the warm tepidarium, the steaming heat of the caldarium. And at each stage there are things to do that are not bathing, conversations to have, business to conduct quietly, news to exchange, philosophy to debate, or simply to lie in the warmth and let the mind drift as the heat draws the day's tensions out through the skin. Masseurs move through the rooms with oil and skill. Food vendors circulate near the entrance. The sound of the water is everywhere, poured and pooled and steaming, and beneath the sound of voices it creates a constant background of liquid ease. Evening comes gently to the city. The quality of light in Rome at dusk in summer is by all accounts extraordinary. A warm, golden suffusion that makes the travertine and marble of the public buildings look as though they are generating their own illumination from within, as though the city has absorbed the whole day's sunshine and is now quietly giving it back. Families gather for the cena, the main meal of the day, taken in the early evening, a meal that in prosperous households might stretch across several courses and many hours of comfortable company, and in poorer ones might be a simple bowl of grain porridge with olives and a piece of hard cheese, eaten quickly before the light fails entirely. Lamps are lit across the city as the darkness comes, small clay lamps burning olive oil with a steady, modest flame, and their light appears in windows and doorways one by one, until the dark city is scattered with these small warm points of orange light, each one the center of some small human world carrying on its evening rituals of talk and food and the gradual easing towards sleep. And in the palace on the Palatine, where the young emperor has been living now for 2 years, in the golden warmth of unprecedented popularity, lamps burn late into the evening, in rooms where courtiers still feel, on most nights, something like ease, something like the ordinary pleasure of a well-ordered imperial household moving through its nightly rhythms. The mood in those rooms is still generous, still hopeful, still lit by the glow of a reign that has, so far, been everything Rome dared to hope for. Though the story notes gently that hope and flame are cousins in at least one respect, they are both most beautiful just before they change. There is a particular quality to autumn light in Rome, the way it falls at a low angle through the gaps between buildings, and lies across the stones of the Forum in long warm bars, amber and copper, as though the city itself were being slowly gilded from the west. The fountains catch that light and scatter it in soft patterns against the surrounding walls, and the water in the basins holds a faint trembling reflection of the sky, and the whole city in those late afternoon hours seems to exist in a kind of suspended gentleness, unhurried and golden, as though time itself has decided to slow its breathing and rest a little before the cool of evening arrives. It was into one such autumn that Caligula's first year of rule gradually settled, carrying with it all the warmth and ease and quiet relief that his earliest months had brought to Rome. The people still spoke of him with a particular tenderness, this young emperor who had opened the jails and burned the old ledgers of accusation and stood in the rain on the causeway as his father's ashes came home across the water. The senators still moved through the marble corridors with something approaching genuine ease, unaccustomed to it, perhaps still waiting for the shadow they had learned to expect under Tiberius, but finding instead a kind of open air where there had so long been a closed and watchful darkness. The lamps in the palace burned steadily in those early months, and the light they cast was, it must have seemed to those who moved beneath it, the light of something genuinely new. And then, somewhere in the late weeks of that first year, the young emperor fell ill. The ancient sources are not entirely in agreement about the precise nature of what struck him, and we must hold the details gently, as one holds something fragile in cupped hands, aware that the shape of the thing is partly obscured by time and by the inclinations of those who recorded it. What seems clear, or as clear as anything from that distance can be, is that the illness came on with some suddenness, that it was severe enough to cause genuine alarm throughout Rome, and that the city responded with a kind of collective anguish that spoke to how deeply the people had already bound their hopes to this one young man. The streets of Rome, we are told, filled with an anxious and almost ceremonial kind of waiting. People gathered at the temples and made offerings, pressing small clay figures and bundles of herbs and flowers into the hands of priests, asking that the gods intercede, that this particular flame not be extinguished so soon after it had been kindled. The story goes that some individuals offered their own lives in exchange for the emperor's recovery, standing before the altars and making solemn public vows that if Caligula were restored to health, they would willingly go to their deaths in gratitude. Such was the fervor of feeling that had accumulated around him in those first months. Whether such vows were made in full sincerity or in the particular kind of theatrical devotion that Roman public life had always encouraged, it is impossible now to say with any certainty. What the vows tell us, whatever their exact character, is that the city had decided it loved this emperor, that it had placed something precious and long denied in his keeping, and that the prospect of losing him so quickly was genuinely frightening. The illness lasted some weeks, and in the palace itself the atmosphere must have been thick with that particular tension that gathers wherever a powerful person lies helpless, where ordinary routines continue around a bed and servants move quietly and advisors speak in low voices and the business of an empire waits, impatiently and without pause, even as the man who must transact that business lies pale and still beneath the lamplight. We do not know precisely who tended him, who sat with him through the long nights, what remedies were tried, what the physicians said to one another in the corridors outside his rooms. We know only that the weeks passed, and that eventually the fever or the crisis or whatever the precise nature of the illness was, it broke, and the young emperor began, slowly, to recover. Rome rejoiced. There were celebrations in the streets, sacrifices at the major temples, a collective exhalation of relief that spread across the city and outward, rippling through letters and dispatches to the provinces, to the frontier camps where soldiers heard the news and raised their cups and called his name, to the markets and harbors where merchants spoke of it, to the quiet domestic altars and private homes where ordinary Romans made their own small, grateful offerings. The man had been returned to them. The new reign would continue. The golden lamp of those first months had not, after all, been extinguished, and yet something had changed, or so the ancient writers would have us understand. The man who rose from that sickbed was not, in some quality that is difficult to name precisely, the same man who had lain down in it. The sources speak of alterations in his temperament, a new sharpness in his manner, a tendency toward suspicion and volatility that had not been there before, or had not been visible before, which is perhaps a different thing entirely. Some ancient writers attributed the change directly to the illness itself, suggesting that the fever had damaged something in the emperor's mind, the way a fire can damage a room, so that even after the flames are extinguished, and the smoke is cleared, the structure itself is subtly different, the timbers weakened, the lines no longer quite as true as they were. Others, then and since, have suggested a different reading, one worth holding alongside the first, without necessarily choosing between them, because history rarely offers us the clean single explanations we would prefer. Perhaps what the illness revealed, rather than created, was a character that had always contained certain unstable elements that had been held in check by the social necessities of the early months, by the need to present a particular face to the senators and the public, and that now, having passed through something genuinely terrifying, having lain in helplessness while an empire waited and advisors hovered, and no one could say with certainty whether he would live or die, perhaps now those elements were no longer quite so carefully contained. There is something worth sitting with quietly in that idea, the notion that great illness does not so much transform a person as relocate them, that it strips away certain comfortable habits of presentation and leaves one closer to whatever is most essentially there. For a man who had spent years learning silence as a survival skill on the cliffs of Capri, who had watched his father and brothers consumed by the machinery of imperial suspicion, who had grown from boyhood in the particular atmosphere of legionary camps, and then in the court of a deeply suspicious old emperor, the qualities that now began to surface in him were not, perhaps, qualities that had been conjured from nothing by a fever. They were qualities that had been there, in the long years of watchful quietness, accumulating like sediment in still water. The senators who had breathed more easily in those golden early months began slowly to feel a familiar coolness returning to the air of the palace. It was nothing dramatic at first, nothing that one could point to with certainty and name. A sharpness in the emperor's tone at a meeting, a decision made without consultation, a look that lingered a moment too long. The ancient sources describe these early signs with a hindsight we should acknowledge, since they were writing after everything that followed, and it is always tempting, when one knows how a story ends, to locate the seeds of the ending in whatever moments came before. And yet, even accounting for that tendency, even holding it gently at arm's length, it seems clear enough that the period following the illness was a genuine turning point in the story of Caligula's reign. The lamplight in the palace corridors still burned as steadily as ever, still cast its warm gold across the polished stone floors, still gathered in small reflected pools on the surfaces of the decorative water features that lined certain hallways, the sound of it always there, that soft, low music of moving water. But the quality of attention that moved through those corridors, the way the courtiers held themselves as they passed beneath those lamps, had begun, very quietly, to shift. Not dramatically, not yet, not in any way that would have seemed obvious to someone passing through on a single afternoon. But to those who lived there day after day, who read rooms and faces and silences the way experienced sailors read the sky, the change was present, and it was felt. For now, though, the night is gentle, and the recovered emperor is simply a young man standing somewhere in his palace, perhaps near a window where the evening air comes in carrying the smell of the city below, lamp oil and stone, and distant cook fires, the ordinary smell of Rome, going about its ancient business as it always had. Whatever is coming will come in its own time. For now, there is only the evening, the light, the water moving softly somewhere below, and the city breathing in the dark. There is a particular quality to silence in a very large building. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of people who are present and choosing very carefully not to speak. This is the silence that had begun to settle into the corridors of the Palatine Hill, drifting like a low morning mist through the colonnades and reception halls, and the long marble passageways that connected one wing of the Imperial palace to another. It was a silence you could feel against your skin, cool and faintly damp, the way the stone floors themselves were always cool, no matter how fierce the Roman summer pressed against the walls outside. Lamps burned in their niches along those corridors at all hours, small steady flames that barely troubled the shadows gathered in the upper corners, and the shadows themselves seemed to lean inward as the months of Caligula's reign moved deeper into territory that no one had quite anticipated. There had been joy here, and not so long ago. You will perhaps remember, if you have been traveling with us through these quiet evenings, the brightness of those first months, the crowds releasing their breath in something close to relief, the gifts distributed, the exiles recalled, the sense that the son of the beloved Germanicus had arrived to redeem whatever had gone cold and fearful under Tiberius. That brightness was not entirely gone, even now. Rome is a city that contains enormous contradictions comfortably, and it was possible in the third and fourth year of Caligula's reign to watch a magnificent spectacle in the Forum one afternoon, and then to hear, by evening, that a man you had spoken with at the baths only a week before had been summoned to the palace and had not been seen since. Both things were true simultaneously. The city held them both, the way a lamp holds both its warmth and the darkness it cannot quite reach. The names accumulated slowly at first, and then less slowly. Senators who had said something, or were said to have said something, or who had perhaps simply looked in a way that was remembered and interpreted later. Men who had held positions of influence, and whose influence now made them appear, through some shift in the imperial mood, more threatening than useful. It is said that Caligula had developed an acute and restless sensitivity to any suggestion that his authority was not absolute, that any gesture of independence in a powerful man, any sign that someone in the room was not entirely consumed by the work of pleasing him, could register as a kind of alarm in whatever it was that now governed his attention. Whether this came from the illness that had interrupted his first year, or from something older and more deeply rooted in a childhood spent learning that trust was dangerous, or from something else altogether that we cannot see clearly across these many centuries, is something the historians who study him still turn over quietly among themselves. What remains visible to us, even at this distance, is the pattern, the accumulation of names, the way the air in the palace changed. A man walking those corridors in those years would have learned, if he were wise, a particular way of moving. Not hurried, because hurry suggested anxiety, and anxiety suggested something to hide. Not too slow, because lingering suggested listening, and listening suggested conspiracy. A smooth, purposeful, perfectly calibrated pace that communicated only that one was going from one place to another for entirely ordinary reasons. A pleasant expression that was not quite a smile, because too bright a smile might seem like performance, but not too neutral either, because blankness could look like contempt. The senators and courtiers and military men who moved through those marble halls were engaged in a continuous, exhausting, largely unspoken negotiation with their own faces, their own bodies, the angle of their eyes when a name was mentioned in conversation. The lamps in their niches burned and flickered when someone passed, and the shadows moved, and everyone noticed the shadows moving without appearing to notice anything at all. Caligula himself, in the accounts that reach us, and they reach us through writers who had their own purposes and prejudices, so we hold them gently, moved through this atmosphere he had created with something that the sources describe as unpredictability. There were days, it seems, of apparent warmth and even humor, when the emperor would speak easily with people around him, would joke and dine and seem entirely reachable. And then there were other days, sometimes following those warm ones without any visible transition, when the same person who had laughed at dinner would become the subject of some grievance, whose origins no one could trace. The story goes that men learned to fear the emperor's favor almost as much as his displeasure, because favor placed you close, and closeness meant he could see you clearly, and being seen clearly meant that whatever he found could be found and used against you. Among those who felt this most acutely were the senators, that ancient body of Rome's most prominent men, who had under earlier emperors maintained at least the form of partnership with the ruler, the polite performance of republican tradition, even when everyone understood that the performance was exactly that. Under Caligula, even the performance had become difficult, because the rules of the performance kept shifting. Honors that seemed safe to offer might be declined with contempt. Caution that seemed wise might be read as insufficient enthusiasm. The Senate met in its great chamber, with its long rows of seated men draped in their white wool, and the collective intelligence and ambition and survival instinct of Rome's most powerful class turned itself, very quietly, toward the single problem of how to remain alive and undisgraced. The lamps burned in the Senate chamber too, and the smoke rose toward the high ceiling, and men chose their words the way a man crossing ice chooses where to place his foot, carefully, with most of his attention on what he could not see beneath the surface. There were families involved in all of this, of course, because there always are, wives and children and household slaves who read the temperature of the men who returned home in the evenings. A senator arriving back through his own door after a day at the palace carried the day's tension in his shoulders, in the way he accepted wine or declined it, in the length of the pause before he answered a simple question. The households of Rome's great families during this period had become very skilled readers of these signs. Children learned them without being taught, absorbing from the air around the dinner table an understanding that the world outside was complicated in ways that were not fully explained to them, that their father's continued presence at that table was something to be noticed and appreciated, and not taken as a certainty. This is how fear travels through a city, not only through the loud events themselves, but through 10,000 quiet domestic evenings in which the word that is not said, the question that is not asked, does its slow and patient work. And yet the city breathed on. The markets opened in the mornings, and the bakers pulled loaves from their ovens, while the sky above the Tiber was still the color of pale ash. The children of ordinary Romans played in the narrow streets with no particular awareness that the great palace above on the hill was full of men practicing the careful art of invisibility. The water still moved in the aqueducts, that tremendous engineered river that Rome had built to carry the mountains down into the city, and the sound of it, that low, constant mineral murmur, ran beneath everything else the city said and felt and suffered, indifferent to emperors, indifferent to fear. The lamps in the palace corridors burned as they always had, as they had burned for Augustus and for Tiberius and for all the ordinary nights between the great events of history. Someone had filled them with oil and trimmed their wicks and set them alight, some slave or attendant whose name no record has kept, whose hands had made that small and necessary gesture of sustaining warmth and visibility in a space that had grown, in other ways, darker. The flames moved very slightly in air that had no obvious source of movement, as though the building itself were breathing, slowly, carefully, attending to something none of its human occupants could name. Let that image rest with you now, if it will. The long corridor, the small flames burning in their places along the wall, the marble cool underfoot, and the stone absorbing and holding all the heat the day had offered, releasing it again now, in the darkness, a slow and faithful warmth. The shadows in their corners, leaning but not moving, and somewhere beyond this chapter, beyond this corridor, the figure of the emperor himself, his elaborate relationship with the gods, his costumes, his temples, the strange theater of his divine ambitions, waiting quietly in the next room, where we will arrive together in a little while, when you have rested. For now there is only the corridor, and the light, and the sound of oil burning in small clay lamps, and the empire settling, very gently, towards sleep. There is a particular quality to marble in the early morning before the sun has climbed fully above the hills, and the stone still holds the cool memory of the night. Walk through the forums of Rome in those soft, pale hours, and you will find the temples quietly present, their columns rising like patient sentences into the brightening sky, their interiors smelling of old incense and lamp oil, and the faint sweetness of offerings left on altars by hands that came and went in the dark. The gods have always lived in Rome this way, not distant or abstract, but close, woven into the texture of daily life, consulted before journeys, thanked after harvests, invited to dinner in the form of little household shrines that burned their small flames in every kitchen and courtyard across the city. Rome's relationship with its gods was, in a sense, a civic relationship, a matter of contracts and reciprocity, of proper forms observed and proper sacrifices rendered, and for most Romans this arrangement was as natural and unremarkable as the turning of seasons or the flooding of the Tiber. And so when Gaius, the man the legions had called Caligula, the man Rome had greeted with such overwhelming love, the man who had recovered from his terrible illness, changed in ways no one could quite name, when he began to dress himself in the costumes of the gods and to receive petitioners in the guise of Jupiter or Mercury or Neptune, Romans found themselves confronted with something for which their long and complicated relationship with divinity had not entirely prepared them. It was not that the idea of a ruler being associated with the divine was new. Augustus himself had been careful to cultivate a kind of sacred aura, accepting temples in the eastern provinces where the tradition of divine kingship was older and more comfortable, allowing himself to be called the son of a god, for Julius Caesar had been deified, while at home presenting himself with studied republican modesty. Tiberius had been cooler still on the subject of his own divinity, dismissing such gestures with something approaching contempt. But what Caligula appears to have done was different in kind, not merely in degree, and the stories that come down to us through the writers who lived in that age and just after it carry a quality of bewildered fascination, as though the people recording these events were still years later trying to understand exactly what they had witnessed. The writers of the ancient world, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, the Jewish philosopher Philo, who would have his own encounter with Caligula in due time, described scenes that seemed to blur the boundary between theater and theology. It is said that Caligula had a bridge constructed between the Palatine Hill and the Capitoline Hill so that he might visit Jupiter more conveniently, as a neighbor might call upon a neighbor, and that he reportedly declared himself the equal of that greatest of gods, or perhaps even claimed a certain superiority, though the precise words are difficult to recover from the layered retellings. He is said to have appeared in public wearing the attributes of various deities, the golden radiate crown that suggested the sun god, the trident that belonged to Neptune, the winged sandals and caduceus of Mercury, shifting from one divine persona to another with what those around him apparently found deeply unsettling. Senators and petitioners who came before him were sometimes required, the story goes, to approach him as they would approach a god, with the particular gestures and words of reverence that belonged to cult practice, rather than to the ordinary rituals of Roman political life. What were those senators thinking as they lowered their eyes and shaped their mouths around words of divine address directed at a man they had known, in some cases, since he was a child in a soldier's miniature boots, running between tent ropes in the camps of Germania? It is worth pausing here in the lamplight of this imagining and considering the position of those men carefully, because their situation was not a simple one. Roman aristocrats were, by the training of generations, deeply allergic to the appearance of monarchy, to the very suggestion that many one man stood so far above the rest that ordinary human courtesies no longer applied. The Republic was dead, had been dead for decades, and everyone understood this in practice, but the fictions of republican form were maintained with great care by emperors who understood that to abandon them entirely was to invite the kind of fury that had felled Julius Caesar. Caligula, whatever the precise nature of his intentions, appears to have been stripping away those fictions, or at least playing with them, in ways that left the men around him genuinely uncertain how to respond. Some, the ancient sources suggest, played along with varying degrees of sincerity and discomfort. Flattery has always been a survival skill in courts, built around the concentrated power of a single person, and the men who surrounded Caligula had learned their flattery in the dangerous school of Tiberius's reign, where careless words could mean exile or death. If the emperor wished to be addressed as Jupiter, then Jupiter he would be called, at least in his presence, at least by those whose first priority was to wake the following morning. Whether anyone genuinely believed in the divinity being performed before them is a question that probably did not have a single answer across the whole varied population of the imperial court. Belief and performance have always existed in complicated relationship in matters of religion and power, and the ancient world was not so different from our own in this respect. Among the ordinary people of Rome, the picture is harder to reconstruct. The writers who give us our accounts of Caligula were generally men of the senatorial class, men who had their own reasons for emphasizing the emperor's excesses and absurdities, and they are not entirely reliable guides to popular feeling. What seems clear is that the city's population had, within the space of a few years, traveled a very great emotional distance from the days of golden hope and flowers strewn in the streets. The games and spectacles continued. The grain distributions were maintained, and there were always those for whom the emperor's theatrical grandiosity was simply another form of entertainment, another spectacle in a city that had always loved spectacle. But the fear that had settled into the corridors of the palace was beginning to seep outward through the social layers of Rome, and in the baths and the markets and the shadowed corners of taverns, it is not difficult to imagine conversations conducted in lowered voices about what was happening to the young man who had once been so beloved. There were temples. It is said that Caligula had a temple erected to his own living person, which was a step that Augustus had carefully avoided taking in Rome itself, understanding that the city's pride in its traditions would not easily absorb such a gesture from a man who still breathed and ate and slept. The temple, the story goes, was furnished with a golden statue of Caligula dressed in divine costume, and this statue was each day clothed in garments matching whatever the emperor himself was wearing that day, a detail that carries a strange, almost dreamlike quality, as though the god and the man were meant to move through their days in perfect synchrony, mirror images of one another separated only by the boundary between marble and flesh. Priests were appointed, and it is said that the office of priest to this divine Caligula was sold at great prices, that wealthy men competed for the honor or the appearance of the honor, and that among those who served in this capacity were individuals who appear to have found the arrangement thoroughly absurd, even as they participated in it. The gods that Caligula seems to have been drawn to most particularly were those associated with power over large and elemental things, the sky, the sea, the sun itself. There is something in this that speaks to a mind trying to comprehend and perhaps to inhabit the extraordinary nature of the position he occupied. The Emperor of Rome was, in ordinary human terms, a figure of almost incomprehensible power, the final authority over a world that stretched from the cold northern forests to the burning southern sands, from the western ocean to the eastern edge of the known earth. Perhaps for a person of a certain temperament, only the vocabulary of the divine seemed adequate to describe such a position, or perhaps the performance of divinity was itself a kind of explanation, an answer to the question of how one human being could legitimately hold so much of the world in his hands. The lamplight in the palace corridors burned steadily through all of this, indifferent and patient, casting its warm glow over golden costumes and marble altars and the carefully composed expressions of men who were learning, day by day, to read the room with an accuracy that their lives depended on. The flame did not distinguish between a man and a god, between theater and belief. It simply burned, as it had always burned, making the shadows move slowly along the walls, and somewhere beyond the palace gates the city breathed its ordinary breath, and the stars above the 7 hills were the same stars they had always been, unchanged by whatever names the man on the Palatine chose to give himself. Tomorrow there will be water, a great deal of water, and the sound of it moving beneath wooden boards and the smell of the sea, for the story turns next toward the Bay of Baiae, and the most extraordinary spectacle that Caligula's reign would produce. But that is a story for another quiet moment of settling. For now, let the lamplight hold you. Let the marble cool. The smell of salt water reaches you first, carried on the warm breath of a morning rising over the Bay of Baiae, that wide and glittering crescent of sea along the coast of Campania, where the wealthiest Romans had long come to rest and to dream. The bay opens gently southward toward the volcanic hills, and the water there holds a particular quality of light, something between silver and pale gold depending on the hour, shifting as the sun climbs and the fishing boats ease out from their harbors, and the villas along the cliff tops catch the first warmth on their terracotta walls. It is the kind of place the ancient world reserved for pleasure, a place where senators and merchants and poets came to loosen the formal knot of Roman life and sit a little closer to the edge of the water, listening to the small waves arrive and depart. In the late summer of the 3rd year of Caligula's reign, which is to say something near the 39th year after the birth of Christ, the Bay of Baiae witnessed something that no one who saw it would easily describe to their grandchildren without pausing, shaking their heads slowly, and beginning again. The story goes, and it is one of those stories that the ancient sources tell with a certain breathless quality, as though even they are not entirely sure what to make of it, that when Caligula was still a young man, living under the watchful eye of the astrologer Thrasyllus, the same man who had long whispered prophecies into the ear of old Tiberius, someone had told Caligula that he had no more chance of becoming emperor than he had of riding a horse across the Bay of Baiae. The precise wording changes depending on who is telling it, and whether it was truly Thrasyllus who said it, or simply the echo of some court rumor that hardened over time into legend, is difficult to say with any certainty. But Caligula, who had always carried the memory of his years of watchful silence, like a smooth stone in a closed fist, had remembered, and now he was emperor, and the bay lay before him, and he had not forgotten a single word. What he ordered to be assembled over the following weeks was by any measurement that survives to us astonishing. He sent for merchant ships from across the western Mediterranean, from the ports of Ostia and Puteoli, and from harbors further along the coast, drawing them together in a number that the historian Suetonius, writing some decades later, estimated at several thousands, though whether the precise figure was quite so vast, or whether the impression of the spectacle inflated the accounting somewhat, is one of those questions that the soft blur of time does not entirely answer. The ships were anchored in two long parallel lines, stretching across the bay from Baiae to the port of Puteoli, a distance of something near 3.5 miles of open water. Between them, across the decks and the joined hulls, soil was spread and packed down, and a proper road was constructed, a road with resting points along its length, with fresh water available for travelers, and, it is said, even inns of a sort erected at intervals, so that those making the crossing might pause in their journey across the sea. It is worth letting that image settle quietly for a moment. A road, a Roman road built not between hills, or across marshes or through the dark margins of a forest, but across the surface of the sea itself. Ships breathing gently beneath the packed earth, the whole construction shifting almost imperceptibly with the movement of the water below, the kind of thing that should not exist, and yet did for a time, gleam in the Mediterranean sun like a sentence written in a language that had no word for impossible. The crossing itself took place over 2 days, the story goes, and Caligula rode across on the first day dressed in what the sources describe as the breastplate of Alexander the Great, or at least what was presented as such, a golden storied thing, the armor of the world's greatest conqueror, whether genuine or beautifully imagined, worn by a young Roman emperor who had spent much of his early life learning to say nothing and feel nothing in front of the wrong people. On the first day he rode, or drove in a chariot, with considerable speed, crossing the full length of the floating road from Baiae to Puteoli in what was meant to suggest the ease and naturalness of a man commanding even the waters beneath him. On the second day he returned more slowly, with a great column of soldiers around him, the whole procession moving in the measured pace of a military triumph, as though the sea itself were conquered territory. The gathered crowd along the shore, on the decks of the anchored ships, in the fishing boats that gathered at a respectful distance, must have watched all of this with an extraordinary mixture of feelings. Some among the ancient sources suggest that the spectacle was greeted with wonder, the genuine article, the open-mouthed quality of witnessing something outside the expected boundaries of human endeavor. Others, writing with the benefit of retrospect, shade the same image toward something more uneasy, as though the crowd watching sensed even then that this was the gesture of a man for whom the ordinary grammar of power was no longer sufficient. Both things may be true simultaneously, as tends to be the case with very large human gestures. There was, it is said, feasting on the floating road itself, great quantities of food and wine distributed along its length, the smell of roasting meat rising from the packed earth of this impossible thoroughfare and drifting out across the surface of the bay, while gulls turned lazily overhead, wondering what the sea had decided to become. The legionaries drank, and the servants moved along the shifting road, and somewhere in the middle of it all, Caligula reclined and looked out at the water around him, the same water that the prophecy had said would never bear him. And the evening came down softly across Campania, and turned the bay first copper, and then the color of embers, and then the deep blue of genuine night. What the soldiers thought of it, the ordinary men whose boots stood on that strange earth over salt water, is not recorded in any source that survives. The senators and the court historians had their interpretations, their worried annotations, their careful sentences that communicated disapproval through the precise degree of their restraint. But the soldiers themselves, the ones who had spent years watching this man move from the diffident, quiet survivor of Capri into something louder and stranger and harder to describe, they left no letters, no journals, no formal accounting of what it felt like to stand in the middle of the Bay of Baiae on a road that had no right to exist, eating bread and drinking cheap wine while the Emperor of Rome, somewhere behind them, defied a prophecy with considerable theatrical commitment. It is also worth noting, gently, that the massive assembly of so many merchant ships for the purpose of this spectacle almost certainly disrupted the grain supply to Rome for some period of time, pulling vessels away from the routes that carried food from the provinces into the hungry city. The ancient sources make this observation with the tone of men who consider it the most practically damning detail of the entire episode, more telling than any of the costumes or the claims of divine resemblance. Because Rome could endure many things, but it could not endure hunger. And any emperor who placed his spectacle above the steady movement of grain ships was communicating something about his priorities that was not lost on those who depended on that grain arriving on time. And yet, even knowing all of this, even holding the complicated accounting of what the bridge of boats cost and what it meant and what it suggested about the mind that conceived it, there is something in the image itself that resists easy dismissal. A road across the sea, 3.5 miles of packed earth over the breathing backs of 1,000 ships, the salt wind coming in off the Tyrrhenian, the sound of the water somewhere just beneath your feet, the distant shore arriving slowly as you walk toward it. There is something in that image that belongs to the older, stranger parts of the human imagination, the part that has always wanted to walk across what should not be walkable, to stand in the middle of the impossible and look back at where the shore used to be. The Bay of Baiae returned to itself, as bays do. The ships dispersed back to their harbors and their proper work. The road dissolved back into salt water and open sky, and the evening resumed its ordinary business of spreading darkness gently across the Campanian hills. Somewhere farther north, across the mountains and the long roads that connected the warm south to the cooler reaches of the empire, other evenings were settling into other places. The Rhine frontier, the lamplit streets of Alexandria, the windswept camps, and the temple courtyards and the slow rivers, all of it breathing quietly under the same dome of stars, the empire resting in its own enormous darkness, waiting, as it always was, for morning. Somewhere between the last warmth of afternoon and the first true dark of night, the Roman Empire exhales. It does not happen all at once, and it does not happen in any single place. It happens in layers, in distances, in the slow rolling of shadow across land that stretches from the cold gray waters of the northern frontier to the golden dust of the Egyptian delta, from the sun-scorched coasts of Mauritania to the pine-dark edges of the Pontic shore. The empire is vast in a way that is difficult to hold in the mind all at once, and so perhaps the kindest thing is simply to follow the evening as it moves, to drift with it the way a lamp flame drifts when a door opens somewhere in a quiet house, bending gently toward the dark without ever quite going out. In Rome, the change begins with the light. The sun in early afternoon sits full and white above the 7 hills, flattening shadow into nothing, bleaching the marble of the temples until they seem almost to glow from within, as though they have swallowed all the brightness of the day and are slowly giving it back. But as the hours turn, something softens. The light begins to lean. It comes in now at an angle, long and amber and unhurried, and where it falls across the columns of the forum, it makes them look like old honey, like amber, like something warm enough to press your hand against. The shadows lengthen eastward. The senators who have been conducting business in the porticos begin to gather their tablets and their togas, exchanging a word here and there in lowered voices, moving toward the streets that will carry them home. The vendors in the markets of the Sabora, the ones who have been shouting all day over each other's voices, holding up strings of dried figs, lengths of ribbon, clay lamps of every size, begin to wind down their calls, wrapping their remaining goods in cloth, counting coin with the particular tired satisfaction of people who have done this 1,000 times and will do it 1,000 times more. Along the Tiber, the water catches the fading light and breaks it into long shivering pieces. The boatmen who have spent the day moving goods upriver, amphorae of olive oil, bales of cloth, timber from the Apennine forest to the north, let their poles rest and allow the current to slow them. The smell of the river is always present in Rome at evening, green and thick and faintly cool, the way water smells when it has been moving through soil and stone all day and has collected the memory of everything it has passed. Somewhere on the far bank, a dog barks once and does not bark again. The city does not fall silent. Rome in this century never quite falls silent, not even in the depths of the night. But its voice changes register. It becomes lower. It becomes in some inexplicable way more intimate. In the apartment buildings stacked along the narrow streets behind the Forum, the tenants are climbing back to their floors, the wooden stairs creaking under the weight of people returning from the bakeries with bread still warm from the ovens, from the taverns on the corners where the wine is rough and the benches are worn smooth from years of use. The smell of cooking rises up through the buildings, garlic and oil, something herbed, the particular thick sweetness of a pot of lentils that has been sitting on coals since noon. Children are being called in from where they have been playing in the alleys below. Lamps are being lit, the little clay ones that sit in niches on the walls, each one tended carefully, because oil costs something and light in this city, at this hour, must be earned. And it is here, in the moment when the first lamps begin to appear in the windows, that Rome becomes something different from what it is in the blazing noon. It becomes small. It becomes human. It becomes a city of individual pools of warmth, each one a life, each one a family, or a solitary person, or a gathering of friends, all of them enclosed in their small circle of flame while the darkness settles gently over the hills outside. Now, follow the darkness east. Follow it over the Apennines, where the mountain passes are quiet at this hour, and the pines stand very still in the cooling air, their shapes dark against a sky that is still pale green at the edges where the sun has gone. Follow it across the Adriatic, where the water at nightfall turns from blue to something closer to violet, something that has no exact name, and where the fishing boats that went out before dawn are now, some of them, still rocking gently in the swells, their lanterns hung at the prow to attract fish upward through the dark water. The men in those boats have not spoken for some time. They are tired, in the way of people who began their day before most of the world woke, and they sit in their tiredness the way you sit in a warm bath, present in it, neither resisting nor seeking to end it. Further east, where the land has dried and warmed and the dust of the roads is a different color, ochre, sienna, the pale yellow of limestone, the evening comes with the smell of thyme and wild rosemary, heated all day by the sun, and now releasing everything they have held, a fragrance that rises up from the hillsides, like something being offered. In Antioch, the great city of the eastern provinces, the colonnaded street that runs through the center of the city, it is said to be one of the longest straight streets in the empire, lit all night by lamps, is still busy. The evening here is lively, in the way that warm cities are lively at dusk, when the worst heat of the day has released its grip, and people emerge from wherever they have been sheltering, and fill the streets and the open spaces with movement and voices and the sound of music coming from somewhere not quite visible. And then Egypt. The darkness comes late to Alexandria, because Alexandria in this era is a city that resists the dark with particular determination. The great lighthouse at the entrance to the harbor, one of the wonders of the world, as the people of this century know it, sends its beam out into the sea all night, a column of light that can be seen, the story goes, from many miles away across the water. Sailors approaching from the west or the north use it the way you might use a lamp left burning in a window by someone who loves you, as a signal that there is something here worth arriving at, something that will still be present when you come. In the city itself, the markets along the harbor are winding down their last business. The smells here are different from Rome. Salt, more salt, the heavy sweetness of lotus flowers from the canals, the particular warm animal smell of a city built partly on the edge of a desert. The papyrus sellers, the grain merchants, the perfumers, they are putting things away. The lamps in the Jewish quarter, in the Greek quarter, in the quarter nearest the palace where the Roman administration keeps its offices, are being lit one by one, and the city settles into the particular multilingual murmur that belongs to it alone. A city where Greek and Latin and Aramaic and Egyptian and a dozen other languages pass each other on the same street, without collision, the way different currents move through the same body of water. Now follow the darkness back, but northward this time, over the Alps, where the snow on the high passes glows faintly in the last of the twilight, long after the valleys below have gone dark. Down into the provinces of Germania, where the legions, those same legions that shaped the earliest years of the young emperor's life, are in their camps at this hour, settled into the rhythm of military evening. The watchfires are being lit at the perimeter. The soldiers who go off duty are returning to their barracks, pulling off boots, unwrapping the cloth they wind around their feet in cold weather, speaking to each other in the low, tired tones of men who have done hard physical work and are now through with it for the day. The Rhine moves past the camp in the darkness, wide and cold and very quiet, carrying its water southward through the forest without any urgency at all. And above all of it, above the lit windows of Rome and the lighthouse of Alexandria, and the watchfires of the Rhine, and the lamp-hung fishing boats of the Adriatic, the stars come out. They come out the same everywhere. That is the thing about this hour, the thing that a traveler crossing the empire from one end to the other might notice and find unexpectedly moving. The stars are the same. The Romans have given them names and stories, and other peoples have given them other names and other stories, but the lights themselves are indifferent to all of that, and they hang over the empire in the same arrangements they have always hung, the same arrangements they will keep long after this particular emperor and all of his troubles are forgotten. The fire of the lamps below answers in its small way the fire of the stars above. The empire breathes, the night deepens, and somewhere in the north, in the strange cold distances beyond the Rhine, a story is beginning to take shape. A story of soldiers and seashells and a march that went nowhere in particular, which would drift back to Rome in the weeks and months ahead, wrapped in confusion and wonder, the way strange stories always do when they travel a long distance before anyone has agreed on what actually happened. But that story can wait until tomorrow. For now, there is only the lamplight and the dark and the quiet turning of the world. The road north from Rome was old, before Rome itself had learned to count its years. Worn into the earth by soldiers and merchants, and wanderers whose names no one remembered anymore, whose sandals had pressed the same stones that now carried the wagons and the marching columns of an emperor on the move. And so it was that sometime in the 40th year of the Common Era, the great imperial procession began its slow, enormous journey toward the Rhine frontier, toward the gray northern world where the sky sat lower on the horizon and the trees grew so thickly together that even at midday the light came through in pale, hesitant columns, like lamplight through a curtain of smoke. You can imagine the sound of it if you let yourself drift toward sleep and simply listen. The creak of wooden wheels on stone, the low, steady rhythm of legionary boots, thousands of them, moving in that unhurried cadence that the Roman army had perfected over centuries, a sound like rain that never stopped, the soft jingle of harness on the officers' horses, and underneath all of it, beneath the human noise of the column, the older sound of the land itself, the wind moving through the oak groves of Gaul, the distant murmur of rivers running down from hills that had no Latin names. Caligula had announced the campaign with considerable ceremony, as he tended to announce most things in these later years of his reign. There was to be a conquest of Britannia, that large fog-wrapped island, lying just beyond the narrow strait the Romans called Fredum Gallicum, that body of water where the tides behaved strangely, and the wind changed direction without warning, and the local fishermen told stories of sea creatures that the educated men of Rome preferred not to believe. The island had been visited, famously, by Julius Caesar himself, nearly 100 years before, though Caesar had waded ashore, fought some battles, and then departed again without leaving much behind, except the story. The conquest of Britannia had sat in the empire's unfinished ledger ever since, a task deferred and dreamed about, the kind of grand ambition that made for excellent speeches. And so the expedition set out, enormous in scale, loud with the noise of military preparation, banners moving against the pale Gallic sky, standards catching what light the northern autumn allowed. The legions were gathered, supplies were assembled, the machinery of Roman conquest was wound up and set in motion, and those who watched the procession pass through the towns of Gaul would have seen in it all the familiar weight and confidence of Roman power on the march. What happened next is one of those episodes that history has preserved with a kind of helpless bemusement, the account surviving in fragments and in the later writings of men who had not been there themselves, so that every version of the story carries with it a faint shimmer of uncertainty, the way a reflection in water is almost exactly the image of the thing above it, but not quite, never quite. It is said that the legions reached the coast of Gaul. It is said that they stood at the shore and looked out across the water toward the invisible island, the gray strait stretching before them, the wind coming in cold off the sea, carrying the smell of salt and something else, something the soldiers from the south could not quite name. Britannia was out there somewhere, behind the haze and the waves. The campaign had arrived at its moment of crossing, and then the orders came, and the orders were strange. The story goes that instead of boarding ships for the crossing, the soldiers were instructed to collect seashells. The Latin word that has come down to us is musculi, little shells, the kind that wash up along any shoreline, small and pale and ordinary, the sort of thing a child picks up on a walk along the beach. The soldiers of Rome, legionaries trained and equipped for war, were ordered to gather these shells and carry them back as the spoils of their campaign against the ocean itself. Caligula, the account tells us, declared victory over Neptune, the god of the sea, framing the episode as a triumph over the waters, rather than over any human enemy. The shells were to be taken back to Rome as trophies of this extraordinary conquest. Catapults were, it is said, loaded and fired out over the water, though toward what target the historians do not quite agree. There is something in this story that resists easy understanding, and perhaps that is why it has survived so well, tucked into the narratives of Suetonius and Cassius Dio, repeated across the centuries with a mixture of confusion and dark amusement. Every age that has encountered the tale of the seashells has turned it over in its hands, the way you might turn over one of those shells itself, looking for something inside, wondering what it means, unable to quite let it go. Some have suggested carefully that something was lost in the translation of events, that the Latin word for shells may have had a military slang meaning now obscure to us, perhaps referring to a certain kind of boat or military equipment, and that what looked to later writers like madness was in fact a mundane logistical decision, misremembered or misrecorded over decades of retelling. Others have wondered whether the soldiers simply refused to board ships for the crossing, whether there was some form of mutiny or reluctance that Caligula reframed, in the way powerful men sometimes reframe uncomfortable realities, as a deliberate choice, a symbolic victory over the sea itself, rather than an admission that the crossing never happened, and still others have taken the story at something closer to face value, placing it alongside the other accounts of Caligula's behavior in these later years, the costumes and the godhood and the growing distance from ordinary reasoning, and have seen in the seashells just another expression of a mind that had, by this point, traveled some distance from the world that other people inhabited. The wind off the Gallic coast that day, whatever day it was, would have been cold and indifferent to all of this. It would have moved over the water without opinion, lifting the surface into small gray waves that rolled in and spent themselves on the stones of the beach, retreating with that soft hiss of pebbles in the surf that sounds, if you have ever heard it, like a long, slow breath. The soldiers who gathered their shells would have felt that wind in their faces and looked out at the strait and thought whatever thoughts soldiers think when history asks something bewildering of them. And then they would have done as they were ordered, because that is also what soldiers do. There were, it should be said, some real actions undertaken during this northern expedition. Caligula appears to have received the surrender or the allegiance of a British chieftain named Adminius, who had been exiled from his island kingdom and arrived on the Gallic shore to offer himself and his limited following to the emperor's protection. The story goes that Caligula wrote to the Senate in Rome, describing this as though it were a sweeping conquest, as though all of Britannia had knelt and offered its neck, though the senators who read the dispatches would have known, many of them, that the reality was rather smaller. A single exiled prince, offering himself in exile, is not quite the same thing as an island subdued. And yet even this detail, set gently beside the story of the shells and the catapults fired at the sea, illuminates something about how this period of Caligula's reign felt to those who lived inside it. Nothing was quite stable. The scale of events as reported did not quite match the scale of events as they occurred. There was a quality of performance to everything, a sense that the gap between what was said and what was real had grown wider than Rome was accustomed to, wider, perhaps, than it could comfortably tolerate for much longer. The legions marched back south through Gaul carrying their shells, and the wind moved north behind them, as if pushing them home, and the gray waters of the strait closed over the whole strange episode, the way water closes over a stone dropped into it, the ripples spreading and fading until the surface is smooth again, and you would not know, to look at it, that anything had broken it at all. The lamplight of the empire burned on through those autumn evenings, in the taverns of Lugdunum, in the farmhouses of the Rhone Valley, in the officers' quarters where men wrote their letters home and tried to describe what they had seen without quite saying what they thought of it. The shells scattered quietly across the stones of the Gallic shore, small and pale, as ordinary as anything in the world, keeping whatever secret they held about the day the emperor came to the edge of the sea and turned back. To the south and east, beyond the mountains and the long valleys, a different kind of wondering was already stirring, among different communities, in the vast and ancient world of the East, where the empire's reach had always had a different texture, a different history, a different quality of light on the same imperial shadow. That is a story that waits for you, very gently, when you are ready to drift a little further. For now, there is only the wind off the water, and the quiet turning of the season, and the long road home. There is a particular quality to the light that falls on Eastern things, a gold that seems older than Roman gold, heavier somehow, as though it carries the memory of older suns, older rivers, older names for the divine. You may have noticed it, if you have ever held an Egyptian artifact in your hands, or traced the outline of a carved ibis on old stone, or simply closed your eyes and imagined the Nile in the hour before dawn, when the water lies perfectly still, and the air smells of reeds, and distant rain and something else entirely, something that has no name in Latin. It was this quality, this ancient and unhurried luminosity, that seems to have reached across the Mediterranean and taken hold of Caligula's imagination with a grip that never quite loosened. Rome had always had a complicated relationship with Egypt. The great general Marcus Antonius had wrapped himself in its rituals and its queen, and had lost everything because of it, or so the Roman telling of that story went. Augustus had conquered Egypt and folded it into the empire, but he had kept it at a careful distance, treating it almost as a personal possession rather than a province, a place too strange and too powerful and too old to be handled carelessly. Egypt was not simply a country. It was an idea. It was a civilization that had been ancient when Rome was still a cluster of mud huts on 7 hills. And the Romans knew this, and it unsettled them in ways they rarely admitted aloud. Caligula seems to have felt no such unease. Where Rome's aristocracy looked at the traditions of divine kingship that Egypt represented, the pharaoh as living god, the ruler as the earthly form of divine power made flesh, and saw something dangerous, something un-Roman, something to be held at arm's length and handled with senatorial caution. Caligula seems to have looked and felt something closer to recognition. The East, with its incense and its ceremony, and its absolute rulers who wore divinity as naturally as they wore linen, appears to have reflected back to him an image of power that suited the shape of his desires far better than the old republican forms Rome still maintained, even now, even under an emperor, even with the Senate still meeting, and the old titles still spoken aloud in the old ways. It is said that he was drawn particularly to the model of the Hellenistic kings, those successors of Alexander the Great who had ruled Egypt and Syria and the eastern reaches of the old Greek world as god-kings, draped in purple and divine epithet, worshipped by their subjects, not merely as rulers but as manifestations of the sacred. Alexander himself had gone to the oasis of Siwa in the Egyptian desert and had emerged from the temple of Ammon declared a son of the god. And this story, which every educated Roman knew, seems to have lodged itself somewhere deep in Caligula's thinking. The story goes that he sometimes spoke of Alexander with a particular intensity, a particular hunger, as though that long-dead conqueror had found something Caligula was still searching for. And so his gaze turned eastward, and what it found there was not always comfortable for those who lived beneath it. Among the many communities scattered across the eastern half of the empire, the Jewish communities of Alexandria were among the largest, the most prosperous, and the most visible. Alexandria itself was one of the great cities of the world in those years, a place of libraries and philosophers and merchants and competing religions, a city where Greek and Egyptian and Jewish and Roman ways of life pressed against each other in the narrow streets and along the long white-lit harbor. The Jewish community there, which had been established for generations and which had its own rights and its own traditions and its own particular relationship with the rulers who came and went over the centuries, found itself caught in the early years of Caligula's reign in a situation of increasing precariousness. The trouble seems to have grown gradually, as such troubles often do, from the accumulation of small frictions and resentments into something larger and more dangerous. There were disputes over civic rights, over the question of whether Jewish residents of Alexandria held the same status as Greek residents. And these disputes had been simmering long before Caligula came to power. But what transformed them into something catastrophic was the arrival of Aulus Avilius Flaccus as prefect of Egypt, a man whose political situation in Rome had become unstable and who, it seems, chose to secure his position by aligning himself with those in Alexandria who wished to move against the Jewish community. In the year that is now counted as the 38th year of the Common Era, violence broke out in Alexandria against the Jewish population, their synagogues desecrated, their people driven from certain quarters of the city, their community subjected to a wave of humiliation and harm that left a scar on the historical memory of that city for a very long time. Flaccus was eventually recalled and punished, it should be said, and not for reasons entirely unrelated to the sufferings of the Alexandrian Jews, though the full tangle of Roman politics that surrounded his fall is one of those knotted things that historians still trace carefully and still do not fully agree upon. But the damage had been done, and the community had suffered deeply. And out of that suffering came one of the more remarkable journeys of the ancient world, the embassy of Philo. Philo of Alexandria was a philosopher and a scholar, a man whose writings moved between the traditions of his own people and the language and methods of Greek philosophy with a fluency that was itself a kind of wonder. He was elderly by the time all of this unfolded, and he was not, by temperament or preference, a man of courts and emperors. He was a man of libraries and contemplation, of the slow unfolding of ideas across long pages in quiet rooms. And yet he agreed to lead a delegation from the Jewish community of Alexandria to Rome, to lay their grievances before Caligula himself, to seek redress in the only place where redress could finally be sought. He left us his account of that experience, and it is one of the strangest and most quietly devastating documents to survive from the ancient world. He wrote of waiting, of being received and then not received, of being led through the gardens of Rome's great houses, Caligula moving ahead of them, and occasionally turning to address them with questions that were not quite questions, more like the playful provocations of a man who did not take the encounter seriously at all. He wrote of Caligula asking them, almost as an aside, why they did not eat pork, and of the laughter that followed among the courtiers present, a laughter that said everything about how the encounter was understood by those in power. He wrote of the emperor moving through those garden rooms, inspecting windows and giving orders about renovations, and of the delegation of elderly men following after him with their carefully prepared words and their carefully prepared arguments and their desperate, dignified hope, all of it trailing behind Caligula like smoke that he did not bother to turn around and look at. What Philo understood, what his account conveys in its careful and sorrowful way, was that Caligula's attitude toward the Jewish communities and toward the broader question of how different peoples within the empire maintained their own forms of worship and their own relationships with the divine was shaped by something more than simple hostility or simple indifference. It was shaped by Caligula's own consuming preoccupation with divinity itself. A community that refused to worship the emperor, that maintained as a matter of the deepest religious conviction that there was only one God, and that no human ruler could be numbered among the divine, was not simply practicing a different religion. In Caligula's increasingly elaborate self-understanding, such a refusal was something closer to a contradiction of the order of things as he had come to conceive it. The question of Caligula's demand that a statue of himself be erected in the temple in Jerusalem belongs to this same constellation of ideas, and it is a matter that caused enormous anxiety throughout the Jewish world and among those Roman officials who understood what such an act would mean. The story goes that the governor of Syria, a man named Petronius, delayed and prevaricated and found reasons to slow the implementation of this order month after month, understanding that to carry it out would be to ignite something that could not easily be put out. Whether it was Petronius's caution, or the intervention of Herod Agrippa, or simply the chaotic pace at which decisions were made and unmade in Caligula's court, the statue was never actually installed in the temple, and the crisis, when it came from a different direction entirely. But all of that still lay ahead. In those months when Philo made his slow way home from Rome, with his careful notes and his long thoughts, walking perhaps through the harbor at Ostia in the pale salt air, the lamplight beginning to appear in the windows of the warehouses and the taverns as the evening settled over the water. The light that falls on all things in the end, the old light, the patient light, finding him there at the edge of the western sea, his face turned already toward the east and home. In the corridors of the palace behind him, others were beginning to turn as well, not toward home, but toward each other, speaking in low voices, weighing things in the particular silence of people who have decided that something must, at last, be done. The lamps had been burning a long time in Rome by then. Not the lamps of celebration, not the lamps of festival processions winding down the sacred way, with their sweet oils and their garlands of myrtle, but the quieter, more cautious lamps, the ones set low on a table in a room where the shutters had been drawn, where voices were kept soft not out of courtesy, but out of something older and more careful than courtesy. These were the lamps of men who had decided at last that they had something to say to one another that could not be said in the open air of the forum, something that required the particular privacy of a closed room and the understanding that every word spoken was a word that could not be unsaid. It had taken a long time to come to this. It is worth letting that settle quietly as you breathe and rest. The slow, accumulated weight of years that brought a small group of men finally to the point of meeting in low lamplight and speaking plainly. Conspiracies do not arrive all at once. They do not spring up like weeds after rain. They grow the way coral grows beneath the sea, one tiny deposit of resentment laid down upon another, layer after layer, until what has been built is something solid and permanent and capable of bearing enormous weight without breaking. The conspiracy that gathered around Caligula in the latter part of his reign was built exactly this way, and the men who built it were, in the beginning, not particularly extraordinary men. They were men who had endured, and endured, and endured, and who had at last found the particular ledge of endurance beyond which there was nowhere further to stand. Cassius Chaerea was, by nearly every account we have, a man who had served Rome faithfully and well for a very long time. He was an officer of the Praetorian Guard, the elite cohorts that served as the personal protection of the emperor, and whose barracks sat just beyond the northeastern edge of the city proper, close enough that the smell of Rome drifted to them on warm evenings. The bread, the burning fat from the cookshops, the faint mineral sweetness of the aqueduct water running in its endless, patient channels. Chaerea was not young. He had seen campaigns and postings and the ordinary difficult work of military life, and he had survived into a position of some responsibility and some dignity, or at least the possibility of dignity, which is perhaps what made what came next so quietly unbearable for him. The story goes, and the ancient sources tell it with a particularity that suggests at least some kernel of remembered truth, that Caligula had taken to mocking Chaerea personally and regularly, had given him degrading watchwords to carry, had made public theater of the older officer's manner and voice, had found in Chaerea a particular target for the kind of cruelty that most stings, not because it wounds the body, but because it is performed for an audience. A man can endure many things in silence. He can endure fear and overwork and injustice of the more abstract kind. But there is something about being made into a joke before men who serve alongside you, something about the systematic diminishment of whatever dignity you have spent a lifetime assembling, that lands differently and stays differently, like a coal that burns slow and deep, rather than bright and briefly. So Chaerea had his reasons, and they were not purely noble reasons. and it is perhaps more human and more honest to acknowledge that mixed motives are the ordinary material of history rather than the exceptional kind. He had his pride wounded, and he had also, genuinely, seen things in the palace and in the government of the empire that troubled him in ways that went beyond personal grievance. These two streams ran together in him, as they run together in most people who ultimately act on something they have long held back. And the resulting current was strong enough to carry him toward what he eventually did. He was not alone. Around him, and not always in direct conversation with him, other men had been arriving at their own versions of the same quiet threshold. There were senators, men whose names we have in part, and whose reasons we can partly reconstruct, who had watched colleagues disappear, who had attended trials that were not truly trials, who had brought their faces into perfect stillness at banquets where they were never quite certain whether they were guests or whether they were something else entirely, something more contingent and more vulnerable than guests. The Senate as an institution had been in a complicated and often frightening relationship with imperial power ever since Augustus had first gathered all those separate threads of authority into his own careful hands. But under Caligula, the relationship had grown particularly volatile, particularly unpredictable, with moments of apparent ease followed by eruptions of contempt and danger that left no one certain of where they stood or how long they would be permitted to stand there. Among those who moved into the orbit of the conspiracy, it is said, were also men from within the immediate household of the palace, freedmen and officials whose proximity to Caligula gave them both the information and the access that any practical plan would require, and whose own accumulated anxieties and grievances had reached a similar temperature. A conspiracy of this kind, aimed at a man as closely guarded as a Roman emperor, surrounded by the Praetorian cohorts, required a particular kind of knowledge, the patterns of movement, the habits of the daily schedule, the moments when the usual protections became thinner or more porous, the corridors and passageways of the Palatine complex that an outsider could not have mapped, but that a man who had spent years within those walls would know the way you know the rooms of a house you have lived in so long that you could walk it in perfect darkness. And so the months passed, and the lamps burned low, and the conversations continued in the careful, indirect manner of men who understood perfectly well what they were discussing, while maintaining the surface language of men who were discussing nothing in particular. These men were not performing heroism, or at least they did not experience themselves as performing heroism. They were experiencing something much more quiet and domestic than heroism, the particular exhaustion of men who have been afraid for a long time, and who have finally, almost wearily, decided that the fear of acting is no longer greater than the fear of continuing not to act. What remains uncertain, and what the ancient sources do not fully agree upon, is precisely how many men were genuinely part of the inner agreement, and how many were aware in a more peripheral way, sympathetic to what was coming, without being fully inside its confidence. It is said that some senators knew the broad shape of what was being planned, without knowing its specific details, and that some who were not involved had nonetheless arrived at a place of such exhausted resignation that when the moment came, they found themselves neither surprised nor particularly moved to prevent it. The empire was large and complicated, and full of people who had their own quiet lamps burning for their own quiet reasons, and what happened in the corridors of the Palatine was in some sense only the most concentrated expression of a weariness that had spread much further than any single corridor. Through all of it, Rome itself continued its ordinary life with the indifferent, inexhaustible energy of a city that has learned, over many generations, to absorb nearly anything. The bread continued to be baked before dawn, the water continued to run in the channels, the merchants along the Tiber arranged their cargoes of oil and timber and dyed cloth with the same practiced attention they brought to every morning, not knowing, or perhaps half knowing in the way that cities sometimes half know things, that somewhere on the hill above them, the lamplit patience of certain determined men was drawing toward its natural end. And at night, when the city settled, and the lamps were trimmed, and the long sighing darkness came in from the sea, those flames burned on, steadily, quietly, in rooms where men who had endured enough sat together in the kind of silence that no longer needed to explain itself. Soon the waiting would be over, but that is a thing for another evening. And for now there is only the soft enclosure of the night around you, and the slow breathing of the world, and all the time you need to let your eyes grow heavy and your thoughts grow loose and easy, drifting like lamp smoke toward the ceiling, rising and thinning, and dissolving gently into the dark. The 22nd day of January, in the year that Rome counted as the 794th since the founding of her city, began the way so many winter mornings begin in that part of the world, slowly, the darkness retreating not all at once, but in gradations, the sky above the Palatine Hill shifting from the deep blue-black of true night through something closer to the color of old iron, and then at last to the pale watery gray of a Roman winter dawn, a light that illuminated without quite warming, that revealed without quite clarifying, as though the day itself had not yet decided what it intended to become. The Palatine smelled in those early hours of cold stone and the faint ghost of wood smoke from fires that had burned low through the night, and of the damp that settles on marble when the air holds no sun to drive it away. The great palace complex that spread across the hill, those corridors of polished stone, those courtyards where water played in fountains even in the chill of winter, those reception halls whose ceilings rose to heights that made ordinary human voices sound small and somehow provisional, was not yet fully awake, though neither was it fully asleep. Slaves moved through the dim passages with lamps still lit, their flames catching the grain in the marble walls, drawing out the amber and the rose and the deep red that lay hidden in the stone during the full light of day, revealed only now, in this in-between hour, by the honest and unhurried testimony of fire. Caligula had been at the theater the previous day, attending the Palatine Games, that annual celebration that had become one of the great set pieces of the Imperial calendar, and it is said that he had stayed late, that he had eaten and drunk and been entertained through the long hours of the afternoon and evening, and that by the time he retired, there was still that quality about him, restless, changeable, impossible to predict, that had come to define him in the years since his illness, that quality which made every person in his company feel the particular alertness of those who cannot be certain which way a mood will turn. On this morning, the 22nd of January, the story goes that he rose and moved through the palace to attend to the day's business, and that somewhere in the planning of the hours ahead, there was talk of whether he would go to bathe, and whether he would take his midday meal in the palace or elsewhere, those small domestic negotiations that form the connective tissue of any day, imperial or otherwise. A group of young men from the noble families of Rome were rehearsing a performance nearby, a theatrical piece, it is said, with music and movement, and Caligula paused to watch them, or perhaps simply to occupy that space between one intention and the next that forms in any morning, the pause before the day commits to being itself. It was in a corridor, a covered walkway, a passageway between one part of the palace complex and another, a throat of stone through which the wind moved even in stillness, that the men found him. Cassius Carrera, tribune of the Praetorian Guard, was among them, a man who had endured the emperor's mockery for years, who had been subjected to the particular cruelty that Caligula seemed to reserve for those he considered insufficiently masculine, a cruelty delivered in public, in front of other men, in front of soldiers, which is perhaps the only kind of cruelty that truly does not fade. Others were with him, men who had spent months in careful, quiet conversation, in whispered words exchanged in places where they believed themselves unheard, in the slow and terrible arithmetic of men who have decided that something must end and have begun to calculate what ending it will cost. The precise words spoken in that corridor, the precise sequence of movements, have been told and retold in ways that do not always agree with one another, and so we hold the details gently, knowing that the accounts we have come to us through writers who were not present, who themselves relied on sources already at one or two removed from the moment itself. What the ancient sources do agree upon is this, that Caligula was struck more than once, that he fell, and that when the blows were done, in that corridor of cold marble and winter air, the man who had ridden a horse across the Bay of Baiae, who had dressed as Jupiter and Neptune and the great gods of the Roman world, who had looked out from the heights of Capri as a young man and understood that silence was the only safe language, that man was gone. He was not yet 30 years old. He had ruled for 3 years, 10 months, and some few days. For a time, in that first stillness after the thing was done, the palace did not know what it knew. Corridors hold information the way that rooms hold cold, unevenly, in pockets, the knowledge moving from one space to another without any single moment of general revelation. Slaves who had heard sounds went quiet, in the particular way that people go quiet when they understand that the wrong knowledge in the wrong moment is a dangerous thing to carry. The Praetorians, not party to the plot, stood in uncertainty, that deeply uncomfortable condition of soldiers who have trained for clarity and found instead a situation with no clear instruction. Caligula's wife, Caesonia, was killed in the hours that followed, and their infant daughter as well. And those two further acts of violence settle into the account the way that stones settle into still water, silently, without drama, and yet with a weight that disturbs the surface long after. The ancient sources record these deaths with a brevity that perhaps speaks to the shock of them, or perhaps to the way in which, in moments of great upheaval, some things are absorbed into the general motion of events and do not receive the individual accounting they deserve. Beyond the palace, Rome itself moved through its mourning in fragments of awareness. News in a city of that size and that complexity does not arrive all at once, but in ripples, in rumors that precede the fact, in a change in the quality of voices overheard in the forum, in the way a shopkeeper suddenly closes a shutter without explaining why, in the quickened step of men with somewhere important to be. It is said that in the first hours, some people did not believe what they were hearing, that the news seemed too large for the ordinary day, too sudden, too much like the plot of one of those theatrical pieces that Romans attended precisely because the consequences in the theater remained within the theater. The Senate convened, or portions of it did, and began to speak in the way that bodies of men speak when a great certainty has been removed, and they must decide together what shape the world will take in its place. There was discussion of restoring the Republic, of the possibility that the centuries of one-man rule might be unwound, that Rome might return to something older, something that by now existed more as memory and ideal than as functional structure. These discussions, the story goes, were earnest, and some of the men who held them believed in them genuinely. And yet the machinery of the empire, the legions, the grain supply, the provinces, the Praetorian Guard who even now were moving through the palace with purposes of their own, that machinery had long since grown too large and too complex to be governed by the older forms. And somewhere in the palace, behind a curtain in a room he had not expected to be important, Claudius, uncle of the dead emperor, a man who had survived decades of imperial life partially by being underestimated, was being found. But that is a story for the morning, for the next chapter of things, and tonight we let this January day settle into its evening, into the long, slow dark that followed a day that Rome would speak of for a very long time after. For now there is only the palace in winter, its corridors emptied of their usual traffic, lamps burning low in niches cut into the stone, their small flames perfectly still in the absence of any wind, the marble reflecting that warmth back in shades of amber and gold, as though the walls themselves were holding on to the last of the light, reluctant to give it up entirely, keeping something bright against the cold. Let the warmth of those flames carry you gently towards sleep, and know that in the next chapter we will sit quietly with all of it, the beginning, the middle, the end, and let the whole story find its resting place, as all stories eventually do, softly, without hurry, in the forgiving dark. The lamps are burning low now, as they always do toward the end of things, their flames grown small and amber and still, barely troubling the darkness that gathers at the edges of the room, and it seems right in this quieting hour to let the story of Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus drift back through itself one final time, slowly, without urgency, the way a river in its last wide miles before the sea no longer rushes, but simply moves, carrying everything it has gathered from the mountains and the meadows gently onward, letting it settle, letting it rest. He began as all of us do, in smallness and in need. There was a woman of formidable character named Agrippina, who traveled with armies and bore her children in the field. And one of those children came into the world already wrapped in the sounds of a military camp, the clank of iron, the low voices of soldiers at their cooking fires, the wind moving through the leather of 10,000 tents. Rome was already old when Gaius was born, already layered with centuries of stone and story, its 7 hills worn smooth by the feet of generations, its forums loud with commerce and argument, and the particular music of a city that believes itself to be the center of everything. Into that world he arrived, small and uncertain, the son of Germanicus, who was beloved, and grandson of Augustus, who had made the world what it was. The camps gave him his name, that diminutive, affectionate word, Caligula, little boot, because the soldiers dressed him in a tiny uniform and laughed with pleasure at the sight of him. And he became their mascot, their small talisman of good fortune, and perhaps this was the happiest he would ever be, moving freely among men who adored him without complexity, whose love was simple and warm as the fires they gathered around on cold Germanic evenings. The lamplight of those camps, falling golden on rough faces, on polished helmets hung at tent poles, on the face of a small boy watching everything. That light was perhaps the most uncomplicated warmth he ever knew. Then the losses began, and they were many, and they were heavy, and they fell upon him before he was old enough to carry them properly. His father died in the East, in circumstances that were never entirely explained, and it is said that grief moved through the Roman world like weather, that people wept in the streets and mourned as though a light had gone out of the sky. His mother was fierce in her sorrow and fiercely political, and she gathered her children around her and made enemies of powerful men, and those enemies eventually consumed her. His brothers too were taken, one by one, until Gaius was the last of them, the youngest, the one who had survived by learning not to speak, not to react, not to reveal. The old Emperor Tiberius sat on that rocky island above the blue Mediterranean and watched everything with tired, suspicious eyes, and Gaius lived in that watching for years, walking the cliff paths, listening to the sea, performing cheerfulness and devotion and filial loyalty with a patience that must have cost him something enormous, day after day, the waves turning below him, the lamp in the window of the villa burning through another careful night. It is said that he never once showed anger at the men who had destroyed his family. Whether this was wisdom or suppression or simply the numbing that comes from long endurance, only he could have known, and he left no honest account of it. When Tiberius died, or when he ceased to breathe, the exact nature of the transition being something history has always kept slightly obscure, Rome received the news of Caligula's elevation with a joy that was almost childlike in its intensity. People wept again, but from happiness this time, and lit fires, and crowded the streets, and called out his name, and in those first golden months he gave them reason to celebrate. He recalled exiles, burned the records of old treason trials, distributed money with an open hand, moved through the city with a warmth that seemed genuine and was perhaps, in those early weeks, entirely so. The flame of those first months burned very bright. Then the illness came, sudden and severe, and Rome held its breath around his sickbed as though the world itself had fallen ill. And when he recovered, and the recovery was cause for celebration, something had shifted, or something that had always been there had been released, or perhaps the long years of grief and silence and danger had accumulated into something that now began to express itself in ways that frightened the people around him. The historians who wrote about him were not neutral observers, and this is worth remembering as we hold his story gently, the way you might hold something fragile and slightly broken, uncertain exactly where the cracks began. What followed was strange and troubling by any account. Executions multiplied. Senators who attended his dinners returned home pale and uncertain whether they would survive the season. He wore the costumes of gods, appeared in the attributes of Jupiter and Mercury and others, and demanded that the divine be acknowledged in him in ways that Romans found deeply uncomfortable. For Romans understood that a man might become a god after death, but doing so while still eating and sleeping and making very human errors was another matter entirely. He had a golden temple, it is said, with golden statues and priests, and the elaborate machinery of divine worship arranged around his living presence. And the effect on those who saw it must have been profoundly disorienting, the lamplight falling on gilded surfaces, on a man dressed as something more than a man, while remaining unmistakably, troublingly human. The bridge of boats across the Bay of Baiae shimmers in memory as perhaps the most purely theatrical thing he ever did. 2,000 ships lashed together, a road of timber and earth laid across them, and he rode a horse across the sea to make a point about prophecy and possibility. And then he did it again wearing the breastplate of Alexander, and the crowd watched from the shores, and whatever it meant, whatever he intended, it was not the behavior of a man concerned with how reasonable he appeared to others. By this time, perhaps, he had passed beyond caring what ordinary judgment made of him. The northern expedition remains even now pleasantly baffling. The march to the sea, the gathering of shells, the return to Rome with claims of conquest that satisfied no one and puzzled everyone. And history has never quite decided whether to laugh or worry, and perhaps both responses are appropriate. And perhaps the honest answer is simply that we cannot entirely know what was happening inside that particular mind in that particular season. And then the corridor, and the knives, and the abrupt end that conspiracies always carry within them from the beginning. The plotters emerging from their weeks of careful, frightened planning to accomplish in a few minutes what they had whispered about for months. He was 28 years old, or very close to it, and had ruled for less than 4 years, and in that time had managed to concentrate upon himself more legend, more horror, more confusion, and more unanswered questions than men who lived 3 times as long in quieter reigns. What remains, now that the story has been told entire, is the sense of something deeply tangled, something that resists the simple verdict. There was a child who was loved by soldiers and dressed in miniature boots and laughed at by 10,000 men in the most affectionate way. There was a boy who lost everything one piece at a time and learned to smile through the loss. There was a young man who rose into adoration and fell into something darker, and whether the darkness was always there, or grew there, or was made there by grief and isolation and power arriving all at once, these are questions that the dust has not answered, and perhaps the dust is wiser than we are, sitting quietly with what it knows, making no final pronouncements. The city of Rome went on as cities do. Its fountains continued their long conversation with stone. Its bakers rose before dawn and lit their ovens. Its priests tended their sacred fires and watched the smoke rise toward gods who maintained, as always, a dignified and ambiguous silence. Claudius Caligula's uncle was found behind a curtain and made emperor, and the world continued turning, and the story of Gaius became one thread among countless thousands in the long weaving of Roman memory. And now, in this room where the lamp burns low and the night has grown very quiet, that thread is laid gently down. You have carried it a long way, from the military camps of Germania to the cliffs of Capri, from the golden early days to the shadowed corridors of the end. And the carrying is complete now, and you may set it softly aside. Let the story rest in whatever place stories go when the listening is done. Let your own breath slow to match the rhythm of this quiet hour. The flame does not need to be watched. The night is doing its work, patient and unhurried, drawing the world towards sleep. Rest now. Everything else can wait until morning.